Greetings and welcome to all. Today is the second day of our PPP forum. I would like to thank you for being here. My colleague, Dr. Joe Ivy Buford, will be with us a little bit later, so I've been asked to fill in, which I will attempt to do. Today's session will focus on PPPs for global public goods to respond to COVID-19, and we'll also focus on how we can define and mechanize global health security frameworks to respond to future pandemics. The audience members can pose questions to the speakers during the session with the Q&A function on Zoom. However, we may not have time for all the questions. Our first speakers are Dr. Victor Zhao, President of the U.S. National Academy of Medicine, National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine, and our keynote speaker, Dr. Elias, President of Global Development of the Gates Foundation. Welcome, Dr. Zhao.
Thank you and good morning. Thank you for joining us again today. I just want to welcome you back to day 2 and on this workshop, Public-Private Partnership. Yesterday, I talked about how important it is to have public-private partnership, particularly now in pandemics and in COVID-19. I give you some really great examples. Today's session is about challenges of success managing global public goods and public-private partnership template for the future. You know, on the global public goods, the speakers we have lined up is just outstanding. They are working actively in global public goods. I know that because I'm working with many of them. I can tell you that when you think about how to address this issue, it really takes a lot of effort from different sectors. When we began this concept of, for example, I mentioned the $8 billion pledge from GPMB, we spoke to the head of World Bank and the head of IMF, and they both say, you know what, we have to distribute our money to member-specific needs. There's no dollars for public-private goods. So that really sets buckets about how you have to find resources to address this really important issue of vaccines, treatment and diagnostic. And so that's why I'm so glad to open the meeting today, because I know that we have a cast of people who's done all that work. Arnaud Bernard, who you hear later on, is leading effort in World Economic Forum in public-private goods, but particularly global public goods and managed Cova that you hear more about, which is our manufacturing. Richard Hatcher, Paul Stoffels are both working on the vaccine side. Unfortunately, I know how busy they are. I'm now, like today, in 3 different meetings on the same topic, and Chris Elias will tell you that yesterday we were on several of those. So, and Mohammed Patay too. So they are actually going to be represented by really excellent people from their organizations. But we're so glad that Chris can make this. Chris, I know it's early in the morning for you. And, you know, I tell you, Chris has attended meetings, particularly WHO Active Assembly meeting as early as, I think, 3 a.m. his time. I've seen him on the meeting many times, so thank you, Chris. If I may, I just want to do a brief introduction. President of Global Development Division of Gates Foundation. He leads the foundation's effort of diverse range of program areas aiming at finding creative new ways to ensure solutions and products to get into the hands of poor people or people in developing countries who need them most. Chris oversees global development's portfolio in emergency response, family planning, maternal, newborn, and child health, nutrition, polio eradication, and vaccine delivery. As I mentioned today, Chris serves on the Global Preparedness Monitoring Board, GPMB, and our co-chair, Asit, spoke yesterday. And of course, he's into so many issues in leading, and particularly in global public goods. And so I really appreciate Chris taking time to tell us his perspective. I'm proud to say that he's a member of National Academy of Medicine. Chris, over to you.
Thank you, Victor. One of the disadvantages of living on the West Coast, there are many advantages, but the disadvantage is that 98% of the world lives in time zones ahead of you. And so I usually do have an early start. This is not as early as usual, so I'm happy to be with you today. And thanks to the National Academy of Sciences and the Forum co-chairs, Joe Ivy and Clarion, and the other members of the Forum Steering Committee for organizing this timely and virtual gathering. I was able to join you for most of yesterday, and I thought it was a great first day for the forum. Your focus on public-private partnerships in response to COVID-19 and future pandemics is, I think, particularly well chosen. The challenges involved in such responses are myriad and enormous, far beyond what governments, civil society organizations, philanthropies, or businesses can do alone. And the challenges are truly global. For years, people like Anthony Fauci, Mike Osterholm, who we heard from yesterday, and Bill Gates have been warning about the threat of a global pandemic. But as Dr. Fauci recently said, the COVID-19 pandemic has spread widely and much faster than we anticipated. And as we've now seen, the pandemic is especially affecting vulnerable groups in all countries, whether they're frontline workers, whether they're people living in poverty, or as we're seeing in many places, as caregivers, that women are particularly vulnerable to the effects of this pandemic, both in terms of their health and in terms of their economic and social welfare. And so it's a global threat that requires solidarity and a global response. And my remarks this morning will therefore focus on how partnerships can leverage the respective strengths of the public, private, and philanthropic sectors. I'll highlight what the Gates Foundation is doing and the partnerships we're engaged in, and some of our partners are also on the panel immediately to follow, and I'll join them in the Q&A. Because I think these partnerships are quite critical for our response to the global pandemic, and importantly, as we prepare for new ones. I think we saw a lot of learnings, and you'll hear some about it, that came out of the large West African Ebola pandemic 5 years ago that helped prepare us, not as well as we'd like, but helped prepare us a bit better than we were for this new pandemic. Our focus and mine today emphasizes, our focus at the foundation and mine today emphasizes the urgency of strengthening the capacities, particularly of lower and middle income countries. Many low and middle income country health systems, as you heard about yesterday, are stretched thin to begin with, and a pathogen like COVID-19 can quickly overwhelm them. Poorer countries have little political or economic leverage given wealthier countries' natural desire to put their own people first. And yet wealthy countries can't wall themselves off from a highly communicable disease that's endemic in poor countries. An outbreak anywhere threatens people everywhere. So we really are all in this together. And I thought before I got into my prepared remarks, I'd just reflect on a couple of things I learned yesterday morning. Two key things, I think. One was, as we had a range of people yesterday talk about their specific examples with partnerships, it struck me that one of the things that I think about as we try to put these cross-sector partnerships together is the importance of investing in the beginning, to actually get to know the partners. Crises like COVID-19 throw people together who haven't really worked together before, and in a crisis there's a push to move fast, but taking the time, as Peter Sands and others highlighted, to slow down and actually understand the other partner, to understand their incentives, to understand what it will take to create a sustainable partnership, to choose a more shared value for the long term. There's nothing wrong with charity in the short term, and in fact, that's often needed in a crisis. But to create those sustainable partnerships, we need to understand what are the incentives, the constraints of the different parties as they come together. And having people who've worked across sectors is always a benefit in that. But I don't think it's impossible if people haven't done that. It's really a matter of getting clear about the goals, clear about the impact one has to have, understanding the competencies of the different parts of the partnership. And I think you'll see that come out in some of the examples and how they can come together for common purpose so that they can create a sustainable platform for change in the acute crisis, as well as in improving health and welfare over the longer term. The other second thing that I learned yesterday And it was framed in some cases as a challenge, and I think it is, but I think there's also an opportunity lurking in there, is that the effect of COVID-19 on essential health services, on primary health care, on the things that we count on to save lives every day, like immunization programs, like maternal and newborn programs. These are already beginning to strain in poor and middle income countries. And that's a challenge. We have to deal with stopping the COVID pandemic, to containing its impact both on health and economic and social welfare. But we also have to make sure we're focused on sustaining the essential health services that have saved so many lives and given us so much progress under the millennial and now the Sustainable Development Goals. And I'll just give you one example of a partnership we're engaged in that's, I think, doing that. You know, if you look at under 5 child mortality, still the #1 cause is acute respiratory infection in young kids who die from pneumonia and who would benefit from oxygen systems. And there have been efforts underway to get oxygen into the appropriate primary healthcare facilities around the world. In the face of COVID, we have seen really remarkable interest because of the greater susceptibility of all people to the respiratory consequences of COVID. You know, strong interest from heads of state, from philanthropists and others in getting oxygen, or often it starts with, where can I get the ventilator? But the ventilator doesn't work without oxygen. And so getting those basic oxygen systems in place, not just to respond to COVID, but to create a sustainable, a durable asset for addressing the #1 remaining cause of under 5 child mortality, is the kind of opportunity I think that we can seize in this crisis. And so those are just a couple of reflections for me on yesterday. Let me ask Alex to, I think you're way ahead of me on the slides, Alex, if you could go back to the beginning, to the second slide, a couple more back, that one. So, you know, in responding to an emergency, one advantage of private philanthropy is that we have the capacity to quickly infuse flexible funding. We're often able to respond very quickly while governments and others are still appropriating funds, larger funds than we could provide for a sustained response. So to date in the COVID-19 response, the Gates Foundation has committed more than $300 million specifically to the COVID-19 response, as well as looking at how we can adapt and repurpose some of our existing grants with our many grantees in terms of how they adapt their competencies to the response. Our investments are primarily focused on working with partners in Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia to address 4 strategic needs that we believe are most pressing and offer in the short term the greatest opportunities to make an impact. One is scaling up partners' ability to detect COVID-19, to expand testing, and also to expand access to treatment and manage the isolation and quarantine efforts as well. Secondly, protecting the most vulnerable by helping partners to pilot different approaches to physical distancing and infection suppressing, often in poor communities where it's difficult to do those things. In this regard, we also, as I mentioned in some of my initial comments, apply a very strong gender lens, because we need to ensure that the needs of women and girls are being addressed, in particularly since as caregivers, they're often in more vulnerable to the consequences of the epidemic. Thirdly, minimizing the social and economic impact of the pandemic by providing funding to low-income countries to strengthen their social and economic safety nets and support for people who are living in extreme poverty and are at risk of falling back into extreme poverty due to the pandemic effect, either on their health or on their employment. And then finally, and many of the cases today I'll talk about in some specific, are about developing products for a sustained response through the accelerated development of diagnostics, therapeutics, and vaccines for COVID-19. Next slide, Alex. So in the wake of the West African Ebola outbreak 5 years ago, a number of things were undertaken to get us better prepared for the next pandemic. One important one is the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness and Innovation, which was launched in 2017 at the World Economic Forum to develop vaccines for future epidemics. And in coordination with WHO, CEPI has now initiated 9 partnerships to develop vaccines against the novel coronavirus. I know Frederick's going to speak on the panel, so I won't go into the details of that now. These programs are meant to leverage rapid response program platforms that were already being supported by CEPI before the emergence of COVID-19. And their aim is to advance as quickly as possible COVID-19 vaccine candidates into clinical testing. They've also partnered with AstraZeneca to support the manufacturing of 300 million doses of AstraZeneca's leading vaccine candidate if it's proven safe and effective. And CEPI will provide support for tech transfer of that vaccine production facility to manufacturing, additional manufacturing sites, creating additional manufacturing capability. It'll also be involved in the purchase of some of the manufacturing materials and reserve manufacturing slots. But I'll leave the details of that to Frederick to discuss on the panel. Another important thing that came out of the Ebola response, as Victor has highlighted, was a number of assessments by the UN and by the WHO, and then finally the creation of this Global Preparedness Monitoring Board, co-convened by the World Bank and the World Health Organization, that both Victor and I have the pleasure to serve on, with Asi, who you heard from yesterday, as one of the important co-chairs. That report that came out in September of 2019 did highlight while we had made progress in preparedness in many ways, we were not prepared for a fast-moving respiratory outbreak. And it's unfortunate that so quickly after that report, we've seen that happen. I can go to the next slide, Alex. One of the other existing partnerships that we are leveraging significantly for the COVID-19 response has been our work with Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, which was formed in the year 2000 and really focused on making vaccines available and affordable for the entire world. We've seen mortality rates of young children drop by over half in the last 30 years, and vaccines are in many ways the biggest part of that success. So at its recent replenishment, Gavi just had a very successful replenishment early this month for its next 5-year plan. And the Gates Foundation made a significant pledge to that as one of the founding partners of Gavi 20 years ago. But in addition, we committed $100 million of new funding to Gavi to support its specific efforts to deliver COVID-19 vaccines in lower income countries when they become available. We're also supporting, through that funding, the Gavi Advanced Market Commitment for COVID-19 vaccines, a new financing instrument within the COVAX facility aimed at incentivizing vaccine manufacturers to produce sufficient quantities of the eventual COVID-19 vaccines and to ensure access for developing countries. The Gavi COVAX AMC is being launched with an initial goal of raising $2 billion for that advanced market commitment, so that that amount is not sufficient for everyone, but it should be enough to guarantee that all frontline healthcare workers, as well as high-risk individuals, have access to vaccines as soon as possible, as well as to create a flexible buffer of doses that could be deployed where they're most needed anywhere in the world to stop the pandemic. Next slide. A final example of a prior partnership that we're leveraging, something that the Gates Foundation's been doing for some years now that many people are not as aware of. In addition to our grant funding, which is considerable, we also are able to leverage part of our balance sheet in something we call our Strategic Investment Fund. Through this fund, we partner with the private sector to make markets work better for poor countries and communities. It aims to stimulate private sector-driven innovation, encourage market-driven efficiencies, and attract external capital to priority initiatives. The fund actually makes direct equity investments, participates in pooled investment funds, makes some low-interest loans for expanding, for instance, manufacturing capability, and provides volume guarantees to underwrite increased production and reduce prices for critical vaccines, critical products such as vaccines, drugs, and contraceptives. Often, there's uncertainty of demand, and that uncertainty gets priced into products. If we can provide certainty of demand through volume guarantees, companies can optimize their manufacturing and reduce their cost of production as well as their price to the end consumer. We've committed additional resources, $2.5 billion of leverage from our balance sheet through the Strategic Investment Fund to help catalyze some of the rapid procurement of essential medical supplies and to help life sciences companies secure financing to produce COVID-19 products. For example, working with national governments and international organizations such as the World Health Organization and UNICEF, we've invested in some bridge financing facilities so that low and middle income countries can have equitable access to essential commodities and to ensure that supply and distribution chains are well prepared to facilitate rapid and widespread delivery. In the short term, this has been used principally for to help the market work better for low and middle income countries for things like PPE, existing diagnostics, and oxygen equipment like oxygen concentrators. We can go to the next slide. In addition, COVID-19 has prompted a number of very innovative new partnerships. One of the most exciting is the COVID-19 Therapeutics Accelerator, which is an initiative that was launched a few months ago by the Gates Foundation, Wellcome, and MasterCard to speed up the response to the COVID-19 epidemic by identifying, assessing, developing, and scaling treatments. The Gates Foundation and Wellcome have each committed $50 million, and the MasterCard Impact Fund has committed up to $25 million. And then those original partners have subsequently been joined by several others, including the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, which committed 25 million, the UK government, which committed 40 million pounds, as well as a number of others that are listed on this slide. The partners are committed to equitable access, that is, making products available and affordable in low resource settings. The accelerator will play a catalytic role in accelerating and evaluating new and repurposed drugs and biologics to treat patients with COVID-19 in the intermediate term and other viral pathogens in the longer term. So far, the partnership has made $20 million in initial grants to institutions like the University of Washington, University of Oxford, La Jolla Institute for Immunology to fund clinical trials to identify highly potent immunotherapies for the COVID-19 pandemic. We've also done an important thing to reserve capacity for scaling the manufacturing of COVID-19 monoclonal antibodies once they're developed through an important partnership with Fujifilm Diosynth Biotechnologies. One of the promising near-term therapeutics for COVID-19 may be the deployment of monoclonal antibodies. And while they're being developed, this deal ensures that whichever companies come up with the most promising monoclonal antibodies will be able to quickly put them into a reserved capacity for production at scale so that they become available and affordable to poor countries than they might if we hadn't reserved that capacity. We could go to the next slide on the COVID-19 Life Sciences Consortium. On March 25th, the Gates Foundation announced the formation of a consortium with 15 different life sciences companies to accelerate the development, manufacturing, and delivery of vaccines, diagnostics, and treatments for COVID-19. Companies participating in this collaboration include Bayer, BD, bioMérieux, Boehringer Ingelheim, Bristol Myers Squibb, SI, Eli Lilly, Gilead, GSK, Johnson & Johnson, Merck, Novartis, Pfizer, and Sanofi. So quite a good representation of the biopharmaceutical industry. And as a first step, these 15 countries have agreed to share their proprietary libraries of molecular compounds that already have some degree of safety and activity data with the COVID-19 Therapeutics Accelerator so that they can be quickly screened for potential use against COVID-19. Successful hits would then move rapidly into in vivo trials in as little as 2 months. So again, another way to harness the existing compound libraries of the pharmaceutical industry in a solidarity effort to find therapeutics as quickly as possible. Another very innovative campaign and a very good example of a very diverse public-private partnership is the effort called The Fight Is In Us. where we're working with a coalition of world-leading medical and research institutions, blood banks, and many others, to drive plasma donations from thousands of COVID-19 survivors. With over 2.5 million cases of COVID-19 in the United States alone, there's been a tremendous amount of interest among those who have survived COVID-19 infection, which fortunately most people do, to how to support the response. And so in this regard, we're looking at the rapid development of new therapies based on the antibodies in survivors' blood. What's interesting about this platform is it involves all of the major companies that are involved in plasmapheresis, et cetera, but also other private sector groups, Microsoft providing a cloud platform for the screening application, even Uber providing free rides to people who are going to participate in the donation of plasma. So a very interesting example of how very diverse groups can come together in public-private partnership in the rapid response to saving lives and harnessing the benefit of those who have survived COVID-19. Let me go to the next slide, Alex. I'm not going to go through this one in great detail in the interest of time, but this is really a summary of the key points that Bill Gates highlighted in his essay in the New England Journal back in February of this year. And I've touched on some of these in my introduction. The importance of strengthening primary health care, of sustaining those essential health services, but also using COVID to get more political attention, domestic resources, and other resources to help strengthen the underlying public health systems. And as well as, an important effort, and again, highlighted in the Global Preparedness Monitoring Board's report, of needing to invest in surveillance, to know faster when we have a problem so that we can respond before it becomes a global pandemic in the way that COVID-19 has. In the interest of time, I'll move to the last slide, which is really about, recognizing what I said at the beginning. The COVID-19 and many global crises are bigger than any of us. They're bigger than what government, private sector, or philanthropy could do on their own. And we really have to look at what are our complementary skills in terms of, obviously governments bear much of the responsibility for strengthening pandemic response and preparedness over time. It's important to recognize that for the donor governments to recognize that the nation's health security is actually inseparable from the global health security. And I think COVID-19 underscores that better than we've ever seen before in our lifetimes. And so governments really need to align their aid programs appropriately, prioritizing public health, and collaborating in the data sharing and the global distribution of new vaccines, therapeutics, and diagnostics. We also need to encourage the private sector, where a lot of the world's innovation resides, to increase their involvement in pandemic response by streamlining their engagement and working closely with government on understanding how to facilitate strong and streamline regulatory responses, as well as managing liability risks. And philanthropy, as I highlighted at the beginning, and hopefully as you've seen in some of my examples, has a role to play in the speed and agility. So I'll stop there and turn it back over to Clarion, and look forward to participating in the Q&A with our panelists. Thank you very much.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. That was diverse, that was focused, gave us a landscape of what's going on, where it's going on, and where you are sharing with us. I would ask one question. On your list of things to do, you told us about so much you're doing. Before we go on, could you give me one or two things that you're thinking about now as the next step?
Boy, we have kind of daily conversations, and we're open to actually ideas from wherever. One question, and I think you'll hear about this, I suspect, from Frederick in the CEPI presentation. I think the world has an unprecedented need to do something we've really never done before, which is to invest at risk in the scale up of manufacturing capabilities for vaccines. We don't know which vaccine construct is going to work. There's over 200 being explored. There's 5 or 6 basic kinds of constructs, from mRNA to DNA to viral vector vaccines. In the usual way we roll is that we figure out what works and then we scale up the manufacturing. But given the demands of this pandemic, we're going to need to have a lot of vaccine as early as possible once we find out which one works. And building vaccine manufacturing capabilities complex. It's some of the most complex manufacturing in the world. It combines engineering and cooking in many cases, right? And so, how do you cook a vaccine or ferment it for the world quickly? And so we're going to have to make some very large at-risk investments. And the world has never really done that. I mean, in tomorrow, or maybe it's actually later today, the accelerating access to COVID tools accelerator is going to announce investment cases for vaccines, diagnostics, and therapeutics. And the numbers are in billions, multiple billions. And a lot of that, and some of the riskiest part of that, is how do we invest in scaling manufacturing? We've never done that before. We need to figure out how to do that, because we can't be in the circumstance where we have a very limited supply of an effective vaccine and it's locked up for rich countries when, every country has between 1% and 2% of their workforce or population is a frontline healthcare worker. I think there's kind of a consensus that the frontline healthcare workers should be first in line for a vaccine, because if they don't go to work, the consequences of the pandemic are much worse. But how do we make sure that there's a reservation of a scarce amount of vaccine or any other countermeasure for that most at-risk population from the very beginning? So that's one of the things we're puzzling about every day, together with partners like Arno and Frederick and Andres in the global community. Thank you.
Thank you. Victor, before we go to the panel, would you like to add anything to that?
No, I think Chris has done such a great job, really in many ways laying the foundation for the subsequent panel discussion. Of course, personally, I'm grateful to Gates Foundation and Chris' leadership for doing so much, as you already heard. So rather than taking any more time, I turn it back to you.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. Again, Chris, thank you. It means a great deal, and you have really set the stage for what I hope will be a great day. We'll now begin with session 3 of the workshops. The next section of the workshop focuses on global public goods, which are goods which benefit and/or cost that potentially extend to all countries, people, and generations. This session will focus on PPPs for global public goods and address COVID-19. The speakers for this session include Arnaud Bernier, who is head of the Global Health and Healthcare Industries and Systems Initiative at the World Economic Forum, Frederick Kristensen, who is Deputy Chief Executive Officer of the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness, CEPI, which you've heard about, and Andreas Seider, who is the Global Lead for the Private Sector at the World Bank. The moderator for this session is Regina Rabinowitz at Harvard University School of Public Health. Let me also state that Paul Stuffles cannot be with us. We just heard that a little while ago. So please know that he wished he could, but he was called away. Thank you. Regina, you're on.
Thank you. Let's go ahead and get started with our first speaker, Arnaud Bernard from the Global Health and Healthcare Industries at the World Economic Forum.
Thank you very, very much, Regina. Thanks to the PPP Forum. Thanks to Victor, the National Academy of Medicine. It's always a privilege to be with friends like you, also Chris today, because we are so much aligned on when it comes to where PPPs can make a difference. And I'd like to reflect on that day on the 24th of January, where Dr. Tedros and we were in Davos had to in an emergency return for the executive board meeting at WHO, and we know the rest of the story. We know also that the virus was probably circulating from quite some weeks before it happened, and it raises a case for different types of surveillance mechanism. I won't touch on it today. I want to reflect on that. First and foremost, the World Economic Forum is committed to public-private partnership in the spirit of advancing common goods, and we did undertake a number of projects during those past months that are truly rooted in principles of universal access, equity, and that's where, in a way, in early March, we launched the COVID Action Platform. And that was an initiative that was decided between Dr. Tedros and our chairman, Klaus Schwab. And it was building, in a way, on the work that had been done before, since 2015, under the umbrella of the Epidemics Readiness Accelerator. And like Chris, you were kind enough to remind the audience, I mean, the Epidemics Readiness Accelerator had a number of streams, but one of the most promising of all of them was the vaccine innovation project at that point in time, that we started with the likes of the Gates Foundation and Victor and Peter Pio, and that we started working in 2016, and then with the friends from Norway and the Wellcome Trust and many others, we were capable of designing the framework for CEPI to be launched, and it was launched in January 2017. It's very rewarding for the World Economic Forum to recognize that two of the most important instruments in the response to the crisis we are in were actually launched in Davos, and that was with the original pledge from the Gates Foundation of 750 million in '99. Then Gavi was born, and CEPI was born in 2017, and it's a dream to see how they work together in the orchestration of the COVAX work stream of the ACT-A accelerator. We applaud the COVAX facility, by the way. And the platform that we launched had three priorities, right? It was about galvanizing the global business community for collective action. It was about protecting people's livelihoods and facilitating business continuity. And last but not least, it was about mobilizing cooperation and business support for the COVID-19 response. The magnitude of that platform, the scale it took, has become very, very large. We got more than 1,200 businesses and organizations mobilized, 39 projects, all of them under the spirit of PPPs, were launched on more than 12 platforms. And in the field of business alone, we have engaged 1,200 executives from 670 partners of the World Economic Forum and beyond. We have convened very regularly those stakeholders through virtual meetings and conferences, and we help them deliver on the projects they initiated. We also launched the stakeholders principles in the COVID era, a set of 6 principles. One of them I would like to mention was about businesses committing to not taking advantage of the situation when critical communities were seeing the prices skyrocket. Those CEOs committed to not do that under those stakeholders principles. And I'd like to also mention that more than 1,600 ministers from 174 countries have been engaged into in those discussions. Practically, I mean, the COVID Action Platform has also convened 65 civil society leaders. It has built an alliance of leading organizations to amplify support for social entrepreneurs. We know it's difficult for those ones to get grants those days. We could mobilize more than 75 million to mitigate the impact of the pandemic on the sector. Many projects, I will name a few, and then I would like to reflect on the previous comments from Chris on the manufacturing at scale of vaccines. Our projects have ranged from developing workforce principles for chief human resource officers to connect essential workers to mobility operators. We launched in LATAM together with Univision and WHO a very powerful program, we believe. It's called Juntos en Casa. It's an educational and prevention program from the young population of Hispanic origin in US and LATAM. One project that I would like to also mention is the one we undertook with this remarkable organization that, by the way, I know you are funding, Chris, Resolve to Save Lives. Resolve to Save Lives was very early in the crisis, very concerned that when the crisis would hit Africa, those social distanciation measures that work in China, work in Europe, work in the US, I think are practically infeasible in Africa. I think if you don't have a fridge, you cannot tell people if they don't have a fridge to not go to the market every day. That would be insane. So with Tom Frieden and his team at Resolve, we connected with Ipsos, the large survey and research company, and we further connected with the African CDC, with John Nkesong and Afro, and we built that project that actually has surveyed with thousands of outreach, surveyed 40 countries in Africa. So we have enabled the reshaping of guidelines adapted to every one of those 40 nations with Resolve, and the success has been so huge. The adoption in Africa has been so remarkable that we are at this point in time looking into replicating that same model in LATAM. So to be continued. We have also worked on helping the industry to actually scale up the production and capacity when it comes to medical supplies, and an interesting alliance was the 3D printing COVID-19 response initiative, which actually provided for 3D manufacturing companies an open access to a set of designs being made available for free by original equipment manufacturers such as, for instance, Philips and Medtronic and GE in the space of ventilators. Our partners have been also remarkably active. We notably applauded Unilever donating 100 million euro worth of sanitizers, soap and bleach and food to areas in need. AstraZeneca with the swift distribution of 9 million masks, and obviously J&J with a funding gift of 50 million to frontline healthcare workers fighting the coronavirus. We will continue. That's certainly a moment in time where we need to think about manufacturing scale up for vaccines. Tonight we are having the inaugural summit for an initiative that we call Manage Cova, which is a manufacturing alliance for global equitable access to vaccines, because we believe that, to your point, Chris, some money needs to be put at risk, and significantly, and the traditional pool procurement mechanism in that particular instance need probably to be complemented by a push mechanism. That's where we will see governments of Japan, India, France, and UK join us in that conversation. I'm very pleased to have your colleague Maureen join us, Chris. Obviously, we will have the pleasure to see Richard Hatchett join us from CEPI, and Seth Berkeley also provide comments. And we have a number of manufacturers tonight that will express interest to be a member of that platform. And that's where we will welcome Sai Prasad from the Developing Countries Vaccine Manufacturing Network to make the opening. I would like to pause there, and I will unfortunately have to leave at 11:45 to prepare for this managed curve launch, but I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Arnaud. I think we will go ahead and go through the presentations and hope to catch you early in the question period. The next speaker is Frederick Kristensen from CEPI, where he's Deputy CEO of CEPI on public-private partnerships, I believe. So let me ask you to go ahead, Frederick.
Thank you, Regina, and thank you. Let me thank Victor and the National Academies for inviting us as well. Regards from Richard, and as was mentioned, there's so much going on today, so he was not able to join this meeting, but sends his regards. Are you able to see this?
Not at the moment.
Not at the moment, okay.
You would have to hit share screen and the green button, and then hit share the blue button on the right side.
I'm sorry, let me just find we tested this and then it worked fine. And now, of course, the presentation does not come up on the selection here for some reason.
You can select screen, which is the very first one on the top left of that box, and then just go to the blue button on the right corner.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
There we go. Excellent. So, yeah, so I had some slides I'd like to share with you just to go quickly over you know, the background for CEPI. We've heard some of that presented already. So let me go straight ahead and say that, as Arnaud was saying, we were indeed launched in the aftermath of Ebola. The world realized that you know, to be better prepared, there was a need for a private-public partnership that could promote and accelerate the development of vaccines against emerging infectious diseases, and not least, enable equitable access to these vaccines for affected populations during outbreaks. And that remains the, you know, raison d'être and ethos for CEPI, also in the context of our response to the present COVID-19 pandemic. And as was also mentioned, and I should call out the fact that, you know, we have several of the godfathers and godmothers of CEPI here. CEPI was launched with the support from the World Economic Forum, and I know we had the Gates Foundation being one of the early launches and early financiers, together with the governments of India, Norway, and the Wellcome Trust, and has later been joined by, you know, Japan, Germany, and now more than 20 other governments, as well as a number of private sector entities. So it's really been a fantastic journey, I would say. So far, let me see if I can progress this. The development, you know, in the initial stages was focused on 5 target pathogens. So chikungunya, the Middle Eastern respiratory syndrome, Lassa, Nipah, and Rift Valley fever, as well as 3 rapid response platforms, which are, you know, platforms or technologies like the mRNA projects that can be adapted to any new pathogen. And the program there was testing each of these platforms for 3 different pathogens at the outset. In addition, of course, with the background from Ebola, one of our initial works and ongoing works has to be to support both the regulatory work around approving Ebola vaccines and supporting the big trial of Janssen's Ebola vaccine in the context of the DRC outbreak, which was just yesterday, I guess, declared over. So when COVID-19 came along, we were able to engage some of these rapid response platforms, as well as the work that was being done on the Middle Eastern respiratory syndrome, which is sort of a cousin of the COVID-19 coronavirus, and initiate development already in January. We, with that background and some other investments, were able to initiate the first clinical trials already mid-March. And we have presently 6 projects of those 9 being tested in vaccine response in human subjects, and with the remaining to enter clinical trials quite soon. So, but I think as Vic, no, sorry, that was Chris who was mentioning the need for a different paradigm in the context of an pandemic as we're facing now. The traditional paradigm of vaccine development, doing things very sequentially and ensuring that we have the results from each phase before we progress, doesn't really cut it in this situation. So the decisions about the early decisions that are needed to make go, no-go decision to actually invest in candidates, to start human trials, to start scaling up, needs to happen not sequentially, but really in parallel. And I'll come back in particular to the issue about manufacturing scale-up, which has been shown to be critical. So all our investments are guided by the 3 principles of speed, scale, and access. So speed, it needs to be accelerated and advanced in parallel, as we talked about. The scale is critical, of course, with the pandemic reach. So really being able to scale this up into the hundreds of millions and even billions of doses. And access, that the developers and manufacturers that we enter into contracts with are ready to sign up to our access provisions. And we have in our contracts already from the start assumed that there would be a global purchasing facility being put in place. So today's launch of the COVAX facility, or at least update on the COVAX facility and the launch of the updated funding requests sort of validates this approach, and all our manufacturers have signed up to providing the vaccines into such mechanisms. So this is the portfolio. So far, it's diversified very consciously across both geographic locations, across different types of vaccine platforms. So some using DNA, RNA, some being protein-based, and some having viral vectors to introduce the antigen to the subjects. Most of them, target what's called the S protein, the spike protein, which I guess everybody in the world now knows about. And as we said, 6 of these are now in the clinic. And I'll come back to the importance of the geographic locations when we talk about manufacturing scale up and scale out. This is an overview, at least some days ago on the 22nd of June, because things have moved so fast. These are the 15 projects that we have an overview of that are in the clinic already. And of these 15, 6 are directly supported by CEPI. We've highlighted the self-amplifying RNA project from Imperial because that was one of our platform technologies, but we haven't actually funded the specific focus on COVID-19. So it's, but if you look at this, then you see that of the rest, they're all Chinese, from China, and except the Pfizer project. So it's quite interesting that of the most progressed candidates in the pipeline outside of China, I would say CEPI has a good portfolio, and of course one of those in our portfolio is indeed also a Chinese project from Cova Biopharmaceuticals, and we also have a project with Hong Kong, which is not yet in the clinic. So as was spoken about, in this paradigm of not only doing the phases in parallel, one of the most important pieces of this is indeed to build capacity quickly. And this is to achieve both scale and speed and access. There's a need to produce early doses to support clinical studies even before we're quite there. Then there's a need to scale this up to industrial scale, even before the clinical trials start. If we want to achieve the goal of having vaccines available for the world in the next 12, or as we've been saying, in the next 12 to 18 months, which is now less than 12 to 18 months, that scaling up process needs to start really early on. And the incentives are not there for the industry to take that on. So there is a need to invest at risk at an early stage. There's also a need to scale out, meaning ensuring to have manufacturing capacity in several geographic locations. And this both supports the expansion of capacity, but it also provides some insurance against national rules for limiting export of final product from territories. Most countries have these rules that if they really need to, they can stop export of necessary materials. So we have been very conscious in trying to find manufacturing partners whom we have partnered and match-made with the developers to have production in countries with relatively small populations, but very good quality and quantity-wise in manufacturing, like in South Korea, as one of the concrete examples. So we have expanded and being conscious that we then have a stockpile of bulk because it's still early days, and we need to define how much vaccine will be or how many doses will come out of every liter being manufactured, as well as what is the dose regimen. So that will come later on in the year. And of course, we also know that quite a few of these projects, not only some, but I would say most, will fail. So for that reason, we have also ensured that the facilities that we have entered into contracts with can be repurposed for other projects. So if one protein-based project fails, it could be replaced by another protein-based project. And so the target is to have 2 to 3 vaccines at a target of 2 billion doses by the end of 2021. That's the present goal, I would say. So it has already been mentioned, this access to COVID tools accelerator, where there's been almost like a relaunch today with more specifics. This was launched back in the early June, and now the partners have really come together and agreed on this target of 2 billion doses on vaccines, where we are cooperating with Gavi and the World Health Organization. We've already heard about the therapeutics accelerator and who's working together with Unitaid. and committed today to a target of 245 million courses to low and middle income countries by mid-2021, as well as under diagnostics with FIND and the Global Fund with 500 million tests to LMICs by mid-21. And cutting across this is a health systems strengthening connector with the World Bank Global Fund, and then we have the ACT Accelerator Facilitation Council really governing this. And I'll end by just presenting on the COVAX. So COVAX is the name for the vaccines pillar under the ACT Accelerator, and where today the facility was presented, and where there's the concept is that this advanced marketing commitment from Gavi will ensure that ODA eligible monies from donors get channeled to ensuring subsidized doses for low-income countries and Gavi eligible countries. And we're inviting, or the partners are inviting further governments into this to create other, I would say, financial instruments that can ensure doses also to participating countries. And I think this vision is an important one in terms of really coordinating and further strengthening the solidarity of the world in terms of having one channel for both procuring vaccine doses. It's a good mechanism to pool risk for those who invest in it, rather than make bets on one vaccine manufacturer. And together with an allocation mechanism, which is being developed by the World Health, under the auspices of the World Health Organization, it can then secure and ensure a globally fair allocation of doses as they get developed. So this is a short version of where we're at. There's a number of challenges ahead of us, including the importance of issues like the last mile delivery of these vaccines in due course, active management of the portfolio, and seeing if there's other projects that should be put in or not, and also issues sort of related to topics like indemnification and also compensation for any challenges from these vaccines. But let me end there, and thank you again for the invitation and the ability to present this.
Thank you very much, and that does raise some questions which the public has already begun raising, but we will forge onward and then get to the discussion section. So next is Andreas Seder from Global Lead Private Sector at the World Bank. Let me turn it over to you.
Thank you, Regina. Thank you to the organizers for inviting me, and can say the same. The previous speaker said, Mohammed Pateh, my boss, says hello, but he is part of the very exciting events that are going on today in terms of the, the preparation for the pledging for the Act A. I want to start out by quickly summarizing what the World Bank has been doing so far, and then maybe moving over to the PPP topic and the private sector engagement. I think, not sure, we have 93 participants right now. Not everybody will know everything about the World Bank. So we are a big development financing institution with global reach. So our business is basically, core business is providing funding to government. We have concessional financing for low-income countries and market-based financing for middle-income countries in very simple terms. We also manage many grants. We have trust funds from donors, and we pass these out as grant money. In the case of COVID, we did something like it's rare in the World Bank in the sense that we basically processed one family of projects that could go ahead very, very quickly in order to provide financing for countries so they can respond to the pandemic. And up to now, that the whole thing started in January, February, and up to now we have 72 countries that are overall, I think the total amount is something in the range of 3.7 billion US dollars that are made available for these countries for financing of their COVID-19 response. More than half of these countries are in Africa, and the money is used about half for procuring the things that are needed, like PPE, medical equipment, and so on. And the other half is for disease surveillance, for introducing distancing measures, campaigns to inform the population, and all the other things that have to happen in order to have the readiness for the response for COVID. So what we learned, and that may be important also for thinking what comes next when all these investments that the previous speakers have been talking about bear fruit, and we will at one point be there and we will have millions and billions of doses of vaccines available. We find that the countries still have their internal bureaucracy. Yeah? So even if we can make money available within maybe 4 weeks instead of 6 months or 9 months, there's still potentially a bottleneck in their procurement process, for example. World Bank has been offering, and this is the only major way of private sector engagement on the World Bank side. I will come to mention briefly IFC and MIGA later. We have been offering the countries to participate in a bank-facilitated procurement. That means our procurement experts go out, do market research, contact all the manufacturers they can find for PPE, for oxygen, for ventilators, all the other things that are needed, and try to negotiate contracts, prices that countries can then go in with contract. The contract would be between the country and the manufacturer directly, but we are facilitating. So we found that the initial demand from countries when they put in their, their estimates for the projects were much, much higher than what they are ordering now. So there's a significant rethinking as soon as they actually see how many ICU beds they have and how many ICU nurses and physicians they have. The number of ventilators they want suddenly goes down drastically. And that it caused some problems for us because in some cases, even countries had to put a firm order, but then later they said, oh no, we don't want it anymore. World Bank, can you get us out of that contract that we just signed with a major international medical equipment manufacturer? So there have been definitely some hiccups that I think can be easily understood out of the chaos and out of the difficulty to, get everybody together in a situation where people cannot meet in one meeting room and have to try to contact virtually and offline. So it's not as easy, and we find that the translating these beautifully designed global mechanisms into action in the countries, it will probably continue to have certain hiccups. And I think the organizations that are currently already engaging in countries such as Gavi, such as Global Fund, probably also can tell some stories about that. So that is that. Let me quickly talk about what IFC is doing. IFC is the private sector financing arm of the bank and has basically 2 main ways of engaging. The first way is to pump money into the banking system so that banks can give loans to small health facilities that have cash problems right now because the patients are not coming, because the patients are afraid of going to health facilities in general. So we see a lot of layoffs and financial problems in private sector health facilities that are not necessarily picked up at national level. The public sector is busy with itself. And so it's kind of a missed opportunity because the private sector could be engaged in the COVID response. There could be a coordination, a division of labor, and so on. So IFC on the financing side provides cash through the banking system that can be used to give loans to these facilities for working capital or for bridging. The other thing is that IFC is preparing, it's not yet passed to the board, a facility that will invite investment capital for the manufacturers that want to increase capacity to make vaccines or therapeutics or diagnostics, and also for other COVID-related products. So the facility will not discriminate in terms of specific products. It's going to be available for everybody who has a case. And that can also, the way it's designed, as I said, it's not yet approved, it will also be available for manufacturers in developed countries for the products that they plan to export to developing countries. Because we recognize that some of the high-tech manufacturing that has to happen may not be available necessarily in outside of the major OECD countries. So that's the IFC side. Then there's one other aspect where we had quite an interaction with private sector and brought in MIGA, which is our basically our investment guarantee and insurance arm of the World Bank. So MIGA insures political risk. If there's a coup in a country, or if there's the country is in default and the government doesn't fulfill its obligations, MIGA can compensate the private sector who has made contracts with the government against this risk, or insure against this risk. And MIGA is looking into providing some contribution to the work that is going on indemnification of vaccine manufacturers, because when you are looking at the risk that is involved in giving out billions of doses of vaccines that have been only briefly tested and limited clinical trials in countries where you have a wide range and mix of people with pre-existing conditions, there's definitely a potential for side effects that are not being picked up in the clinical trials. And the companies want to be indemnified. They don't want to, they don't want that people go back then to their home countries and sue them. So that is a working group that I was participating. It is now integrated into the COVAX work. And MIGA could be a potential contributor in the sense that if governments pick up a responsibility in this process, then MIGA could step in and provide the risk insurance in case the government doesn't fulfill its obligations. So this is a little bit summary as to what the World Bank is actually doing. I just want to conclude in mentioning briefly this public good aspect here that we are putting forward. I mean, we are basically, I see this as an aspiration. We want these products that are being developed and are necessary in order to curb the pandemic and prevent us from future outbreaks. We want them to be public goods. They are not by nature public goods because they are not available in unlimited amounts. So we have to do a lot jointly in order to ensure availability, but also to ensure access and affordability. And it's not only about the price. We see one major barrier, as I mentioned earlier, in the country capacity to actually roll out the vaccines and roll out the treatments once available, and roll them out in a way that is fair and that is fully inclusive of the marginalized population. So let me stop here, and I'm sure it's better to have some time for questions and answers. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I'd like to, first of all, recognize from all of the speakers that you have painted a picture, a phenomenal change in the past 6 months. I know none of us thought we would be here today talking about an impressive, diverse set of targets, diverse set of mechanisms to scale up a global response to a pandemic. And I've lived my life, a lot of it in the vaccine world, where if you talk to flu people, they were always worrying about what would happen the next year, and to have it happen with coronavirus and to have it happen at the scale was the worst nightmare. You have painted a picture of a diverse set of investments, and I think it was Arnaud who called it push. in quite a visible way, and then push-pull, what's being driven by the donors, what's being driven to try to solve problems. So let me ask you the opposite of what you were asked to talk about. Part of being successful at creating a product is, of course, the systems and ability to use it. We have some models, not from a pandemic, but from a very visible, fear-driven set of epidemics for meningitis A, and I know Chris Elias will be quite familiar with this, in which the country voice was quite evident in deciding how to use limited annual supply, still phenomenal compared to what was available before that. And where they not only made it work in terms of decisions about who would get it, how to scale it, how to have maximum impact, but also what happened if there was an intervening pandemic and epidemic and refocusing that supply elsewhere. The third part of it was the scale at which they did it. And I had the fortune to be in Burkina Faso when the meningitis A first dose was given. And I told my boss at that time that I was going there for the launch, and that they were going to immunize 1 to 29-year-olds in 10 days in the country through public-private partnership. And he said, it'll never happen. And I came back and I said, you're right. They didn't do it in 10 days. They did it in 8. And such is the fear and the driver for immunization in the context of an epidemic or a pandemic. So my question to all of you, because you're working for big organizations, making incredibly valuable investments, where is the country voice in all of this? Let me open it up. Maybe Chris, I could ask you to start.
Yeah, I'm happy to start, Gina. I was on mute. I think a couple of things. The one thing that I think there's consensus on, and it came out in, I think, Frederick's presentation and others, is that the World Health Organization is really leading on defining a set of principles for the fair and equitable and effective allocation of what are anticipated to be scarce countermeasures. That will apply to next generation diagnostics as well as to therapeutics. If we're lucky and there's a widely available therapeutic that shows some effectiveness against COVID-19, it may not be a big problem, but certainly any novel therapeutic is going to initially be scarce. And that's certainly going to be true for vaccines, given the complexity of scaling the manufacturing. So in the Access to COVID Tools Accelerator, we've been having an important set of discussions about how do you prepare for that eventuality. And where the country voice comes in is through the World Health Organization's consultations with their member states. They've had one initial consultation. They're having another one next week. And I think that's quite critical, because if you'll recall the situation back in 2010, when we launched the MenA vaccine in Burkina Faso, we had about 25 million doses of that vaccine the first year, and we had 350 million people in the meningitis belt who needed it and wanted it, as you demonstrated from the evident demand. The WHO led a process in that case as well, where they consulted with the countries in the meningitis belt to balance things like endemicity, the disease burden, the preparedness of the health system, the importance of being able to launch in places where there was good post-introduction surveillance, because to the point that Andreas made, we're going to go from small studies to very big deployment very quickly. So And in the end, as you know, the decision was made to launch the initial 25 million doses of the meningitis vaccine in Burkina Faso and neighboring parts of Mali and Niger. The 20-some countries of the meningitis belt understood the process. Some of them weren't happy with the final decision, but they respected the process justice, if you will, that was led by the WHO. And so of all of the different partners involved in this Accelerating COVID Tools Accelerator, the WHO is seen, I think, universally as the group that has all 194 members of the World Health Assembly as participating in their governance process. And so it's the WHO that's bringing in, has already started to bring in that country perspective in the allocation. It's going to be very complicated, but they've begun at some speed to have that robust discussion. The final thing I'd say that's to your point about the demand for the vaccine is that unfortunately a lot's changed in the last 10 years and not all of it's good. Unlike what we didn't have very much of in Burkina Faso in 2010 was the epidemic of disinformation that's being put out about all vaccines and about those partners involved in developing vaccines. So, you know, as you saw, you know, and as we all saw, you know, they covered 99% of the 1 to 29-year-old population in less time than was anticipated. I remember having been in Burkina Faso then, going out the day before the launch to a village and saying to the local district health officer, how are you going to get people to come? And he said, that's not going to be our problem. Our problem is going to be crowd control. And it was. We're in a different world today. You know, the amount of conspiracy and disinformation that's out there about vaccines, even life-saving vaccines that we save kids' lives with every day, is disturbing. And the disinformation seems to be doing better than the accurate information from traditional partners like the UN and the Gates Foundation and others. So I do think we have to deal with, as we get close to launching a vaccine, you know, should the science play out as we hope, we're going to also have to deal with what the WHO likes to call the infodemic that is following this epidemic around the world. So I think it's going to be harder than it was in 2010. Over.
Okay, thank you. I think Arnaud had a comment.
Yes, and I think there's no discussion that, and that's where the COVAX construct is sound. It places WHO front and center when it comes to allocation principles. My worry is of a different nature. If we look into the various announcements from J&J, AstraZeneca, to some extent Merck, you come to a total of 2 billion doses, give or take. And that's in a context where it may be that we need 2 doses. So you're talking about 1 billion people. And the only amount of that quantity that has been clearly pledged to LMIC is in the context of that arrangement that Frederick, you described between CEPI and AstraZeneca for 300 million doses. So we're very, very, very far from providing any type of adequate coverage to LMICs. In the meantime, you see a frenzy of very early pledging capacity agreement from the most credible manufacturers to a limited number of vaccine innovators. And those pairings are done, in our views, too early, because there are 60% of the scale-up investment required is non-specific. So Why is that we don't promote a push mechanism that would provide the funding for manufacturers to scale up, say, fill finish to a point, formulation fill finish capacity in an exhaustive fashion, and would delay the pairing with the right vaccine at the moment in time where the clinical evidence from phase 3, to be defined which clinical evidence, would trigger the pairing. And I think this is really the opportunity. And this is really what we want to discuss today during this inaugural summit of Managed Cov, because we think there is a formidable opportunity to actually create a manufacturing alliance that would increase the supply by, at a minimum, 2 billion doses with 5 or 6 hubs that would each of them invest $400 million. And that's great to have the backing from the IFC, by the way, Andreas, because the financing construct that the IFC is proposing, I think, is very right under that paradigm. I would pause there.
Thank you. There have been a number of questions that have been raised both by panel and the public that in some ways reflect this deep skepticism about the role of industry that was alluded to on day one, but also perhaps lack of understanding of how all these deals are being brokered and how the private sector is best engaged. And it really hits at the manufacturing. So first, could I ask Frederick, perhaps, I know the Gates Fund, everyone's making investments in manufacturing, but even 2 billion, to fully immunizing 2 billion is still less than what would be needed ultimately, and yet that's so much larger. And I'm not sure everyone understands that it takes maybe, usually 4 to 5 years to establish a committed manufacturing facility for vaccines, which is different than what's required for drugs. But there's some there would be gaps in non-specific fill and finish, et cetera. So Frederick, perhaps you could comment on, from a group that is funding the development and of an array of vaccines, some of them that are quite novel, for which we don't have a example in class that's already licensed, to more traditional approaches. The challenges and the ability to do the planning to maximize supply against the framework that you laid out, which you called speed, scale, and access. Let me ask you to comment on that.
Yeah, thanks. I think this is definitely one of the questions of our time, and there's no very easy answer. I think Arnaud is pointing to a critical challenge, which is it will take time to get to the number of doses that the world really requires. And I think that's why in the launch today, the World Health Organization went out and said that there are initial thoughts now of how to do this in terms of vaccinating healthcare workers first, people over the age of 65, and other adults with comorbidities, so that you at least get the mortality, even if it is low, but within those groups it's not that low, and that would be an initial recommendation, at least for national strategies. The other piece of this is probably, going back to your comment that there's some maybe lack of understanding and some skepticism to the industry's role in this, and I think this pandemic has clearly demonstrated that you need the industry to achieve this goal. There's only so many manufacturers that exist that have the capacities to produce at the volumes we're talking about. And I saw one of the comments was, could we manufacture in developing countries? And yes, absolutely. I think manufacturers, of course, in India, in China, and others are already stepping up, and there are these discussions going on with other members of what's called the Developing Country Vaccine Manufacturers Network. A third dimension to this is the contracts that we're putting in place, which, you know, CEPI has published how those contracts have been construed pre-COVID, and we're in the process of summarizing the contracts so far, and we'll be publishing those. But as part of that, we have, as I mentioned in my comments, that we make sure that there's a geographic distribution of this vaccine manufacturing, that the prices are discussed and either committed at no profit levels, or at least agreeing to entering into a negotiation in good faith with the global purchasing or the COVAX facility that Gavi is setting up. We have step-in rights to ensure that these projects go forward, even if there's any troubles with partners living up to their access commitments. And we ensure that all data and materials are shared with all parties in a transparent fashion, and that there's also some of our investments in more enabling science pieces like animal models or standards and assays, and all of this gets to be accessible by all developers. So there are a number of ways to try to ensure that we make these vaccines as accessible as absolutely practically possible. I mean, we're living in a real world with the challenges that Arnaud was pointing to of bilateral deals being made and other challenges. So yeah. And then just also ahead. One quick comment on Chris's point of this infodemic, and I saw Scott Ratsan's comment. I think we've been engaging also with Scott and other partners from the London School of Hygiene, Tropical Medicine, and Wilton Park and others who are now working on setting up this new coalition together with WHO and UNICEF and others to really try to get ahead of what we can expect to become much worse than what we've seen so far. So to really work on the demand side as well, so to speak.
Yes, Arnaud, I see your hand up.
Yeah, I think I want to absolutely insist on the urgency. Of the 2 billion that have been communicated by AstraZeneca and J&J, I think over than 300 million doses. The rest has been pledged to the US, the UK, 4 European nations that are France, Italy, Germany, and the Netherlands. So don't believe a minute those volumes will be allocated to the globe under the WHO principles that were explained today. Those nations are not going to listen a minute about principles of healthcare workers globally, the 65-year-olds and the ones with comorbidity. This is in a context where the manufacturing volumes last year, as published by WHO, were less than 3.5 billion of vaccine doses globally. If we don't stop that frenzy whereby every government contract is being assigned or attached to one of the best vaccines manufacturers, we are going to fail. And that pairing is simply following traditional market forces. If you get a 1.2 billion deal with BARDA, you'd better secure a large deal with Serum Institute of India, and the capacity is gone, game over. The push mechanism is an incentive provided to manufacturers for them to be less impatient in their pairing, for the right vaccines to win, and for the right vaccines to be provided to the COVAX facility for them to buy. Without a push mechanism, there is zero incentive for manufacturers to wait for that pairing to happen. They simply have to take the best deal. And I can tell you, It was AstraZeneca yesterday. It will be J&J and Merck tomorrow.
You know you're on mute.
Mute, thank you. You make a very good point, and that was going to be my next question. As I saw the map of distributed initial investments in manufacturing, that there was nothing in India, which has been the wizards of scaled up, low cost, very safe and productive manufacturing, say of measles vaccine. Serum Institute of India manufacturing, what, 80–85% of the world's supply. But other manufacturers also. And then we've received questions, of course, what about Africa and setting up manufacturing base in Africa? It raises the question of where we would have wanted to build capacity 5 years ago, so we would have it today. And not having done that 5 years ago, how do we think about extending? And you've talked a little bit about it, Frederick, but let me turn it back to Chris, because you're making investments in facilities and have a huge investment in Gavi. In extending that manufacturing capacity, which is a critical element of access.
So thanks, Gina. Maybe make a couple of comments in response to your question and building on Arnaud's. You know, the vaccine manufacturing landscape is a very complex one. And scaling vaccine manufacturing, particularly at risk, is an expensive and time-consuming proposition. So to the role of, you want to be able to use as much as possible existing facilities that can be repurposed, you know, sort of turnkey or kind of brownfield, as opposed to building brand new facilities, which take a very long time to build. These are some of the most appropriately highly regulated facilities in engineering, bioengineering, and take often years to get certified for actual production and release. And so the point that you've made about the role of the developing country vaccine manufacturers is quite critical, because to get to global scale, those manufacturers are going to have to play a critical role. Many of them are in India, others are in places like Indonesia, Brazil, et cetera. We're also going to have to break down the components of the manufacturing to minimize the risk that we need to put into scale. Arnaud mentioned fill and finish. Fill and finish, which is a complex operation, it's much more complicated than it sounds, is one aspect of the vaccine production that is probably repurposable, whereas the production facility for a protein vaccine is not easily, maybe possible to repurpose for another protein vaccine, but it's very difficult to do for some other, a viral vector vaccine, et cetera. So what components of the vaccine manufacturing process have been bottlenecks? Historically, fill and finish, remarkably, has been a significant bottleneck, even for children's vaccines. So let's find those bottlenecks, let's find those pieces that are more easily repurposed, because we don't know which vaccine is going to work today. The other comment I would make is that I think we have to see the push funding, the kind of efforts that Frederick described from CEPI, and the pull funding of the COVAX facility as complementary to each other. The push funding is extremely important, because that's how we get more vaccine to allocate, right? The allocation is probably going to face conditions of scarcity under any circumstance, but it's less difficult with 3 billion doses than it is with 1. And the one thing I would say, and I think this is where we're missing Paul being on the panel, I think some companies are actually, as part of their thinking about their responsibility, going to make some capacity reservation for healthcare workers. And that's, I think that's an active discussion within the industry. And so we need to place these at-risk bets to produce as much vaccine as we can as quickly as possible. And then we need the COVAX facility as a pull mechanism that actually represents the opportunity for countries to, if you will, hedge their bets. There are very few countries, maybe only one, that can afford to commit billions of dollars of its own domestic resources at risk to lock up capacity and, quote, vaccine nationalism. Most countries might be able to sign one deal or two deals, but there's no guarantee, given that, you know, if you look at historically, there's probably a less than 10% chance that any one vaccine is going to succeed. Success will come from a broad portfolio. That's how drug discovery and vaccine development works. So participating in the COVAX facility is an opportunity for countries to make sure that they have some access to whatever vaccine succeeds. Now, I suspect that high-income countries will do a bit of both. They'll do some bilateral deals, which they think from science are likely to succeed. And if they're smart, they would hedge their bets by also participating in COVAX. The final thing I'd say is that there's a very important, very large portion of the market that we often forget about, which are the middle-income countries, which actually are the homes to most of the vaccine scale capacity that you mentioned, and aren't going to be able to place bilateral nationalist deals on even one or perhaps all vaccines. So I think the COVAX facility should be very attractive to those middle-income, upper middle-income countries that want to be able to secure vaccine access for their populations. It's going to be their best bet. And I think actually for high-income countries that aren't able to invest in the entire portfolio, the best way to invest in that portfolio, it's kind of like a mutual fund, is through the COVAX facility. Over. You're on mute again.
Yeah, no, I do that so because there tends to be an echo. Do any of the other speakers want to make a response to this?
Yeah, Andreas here.
Andreas, please.
Yeah, I was listening with great interest. So there's a couple of things that are on my mind. First of all, in terms of the country voices, when we talk to the government, we hear a country voice, but the government doesn't necessarily represent the poor and disenfranchised part of the population and those that are far away from the capital cities. So whatever plans governments come up with are not necessarily achieving the objective in the in the full sense as we would like to see it from the global level, and we know that very well as as World Bank that is used to working with governments but with the pro-poor focus. So it's always it's a piece of hard work, and it's a lot of targeted monitoring evaluation to make sure that the investments are not captured by those that need them least. And that's going to be similar here. I was thinking a while ago already, is there something like a standardized tool where we can assess countries' readiness to actually apply or utilize whatever number of vaccine doses they get? Let's think beyond just the frontline health workers. So let's go a step further when we have more to distribute, and then you don't have enough for everybody, but you can say the country that scores highest in terms of having a good plan and making sure that whatever we give into this country is actually reaching the population in a fair and equal way. So that could be, I don't know whether this is part of the WHO allocation mechanism, but it could be useful. It could also be useful in stimulating countries to think about, what do I do once I get vaccines, once I get therapeutics, am I ready for it? And it is an opportunity to bring in civil society and make sure that it's not all dominated by the government. My personal experience is when you talk to the government, you get one piece of information. When you go out into the village and you talk to the real people, you get a different viewpoint. So it's fairly consistent. And maybe Burkina Faso, maybe they have better line of communication between those people that you talk to in Ouagadougou and those in the village. But in some countries, it's there's quite some differences in that. So that is the key point I have on my mind. I think all the other discussion, I'm fully with Arnaud on saying, this is it's the criteria under which big private sector companies make decisions, they are clear, they are transparent, and they are not necessarily in favor of the large, masses of poor people living in large middle income countries, which is maybe the group that is most at risk of being left behind. Over.
So we won't resolve that today, and we know that there are groups that are, that WHO is leading discussions of principles, which then becomes how those principles get turned to action and countries evaluate it. And we saw some of that with meninge. We've seen it with other global goods. Let me elevate the discussion a little bit away from vaccines, because I know we could talk I could talk about vaccines for the next couple of hours, and I know that's we should maybe take it a little bit broader. All of you have talked about both push funding and requirements of countries, but in terms of public-private partnerships, it's been about engaging industry and creating a range of solutions, whether it's PPE, the manufacturing facility for anything, whether it's a drug or mass. And I live in a highly endemic country where there's a great deal of disparity between government and what's happening in every single state. So I understand the complexity that you were talking about, but how do we manage this need for collaboration and the reality of competition from the private sector point of view? It's a balance. We need to have arrangements at every single aspect, but it's really a competitive landscape. They're proving their new technology. There's drivers for engagement. Any words of wisdom from what you learned in the past 6 months or before? Chris.
So, Regina, I could make a couple of comments. I think that the COVID pandemic exposed some of the vulnerabilities of the systems that were not working well and then fell apart in the face of distress. And we often talk about the market failures. I mean, one of the things I mentioned that we've done with our strategic investment fund is to try and put in place some bridge financing facilities with WHO and UNICEF, because they were frankly, they often aggregate the demand from very poor countries and then go and purchase it. UNICEF has played this role remarkably well in vaccines historically, and for things like educational school supplies, et cetera. But in the face of a global shortage, as well as a global distribution that was highly lumpy, if you will, of PPE, those procurement efforts where in typical UN procurement, you release the purchase order, you pay when it arrives, in a very competitive market for PPE, producers were demanding payment upfront. That's not how the UN usually does procurement. They have a very conservative, for good reasons, a procurement system that was just not able, without some innovations in bridge financing, to be competitive in a market. They would place an order and they'd get out competed by a rich country and lose that supply. And so, shoring up the existing system, as well as we're seeing some very interesting innovations. There's a number of African philanthropists working together with the Africa CDC and the African Union, and a variety of private sector companies in Africa that are putting together this African supply platform for procuring PPE and diagnostics and oxygen concentrators, and are in discussion about things like the recent, evidence we saw last week on dexamethasone for severely ill people, et cetera. So, there's a need to create new things, as well as strengthening existing multilateral procurement systems for dealing with a market that's inefficient at best and broke down in the face of acute supply. And we need to learn from that, because if the system wasn't ready to get masks and gowns, it's not going to be ready to function efficiently for a vaccine or a life-saving new drug. So this is, we're learning from, trying to fix those and strengthen those procurement systems now, as well as the allocation. And just the last thing I'd say is to the note that, WHO had its initial member state consultation, and some of the early feedback from the member states makes it clear that the allocation is a two-step process. There's the global allocation, that is how does the COVAX facility or the Therapeutics Accelerator and the Global Fund, how do they make decisions about allocating scarce commodities to countries? But then the second step, and it's very clear in the member state feedback, is that second step is going to be made by countries. Countries are going to make their own allocations of, if they get 2% of the global supply to cover their health workforce and essential workers, they're going to make those decisions about who's an essential worker. Do they prioritize high-risk groups versus groups that will keep the economy going? The member states have been clear that that's going to be their decision, not anybody else's. So there's going to need to be, as supply expands, it'll get easier, right? But some of the initial allocation will have to be driven by a set of principles. And I think the broader community is looking to WHO for that. And then I think WHO has another role of providing strong guidance in its typical way of providing technical guidance and analysis to drive difficult policy decisions to countries. But it's clear that that second step is countries are going to make, with whatever supply they're able to secure, they're going to make their own decisions about allocation. So some of what Andreas was saying about the importance of engaging civil society and others, particularly at the country level, to ensure accountability for those decisions in the allocation process is going to be quite critical. Over.
All right, thank you very much. We have a limited number of minutes, and I think we're going to give you a little bit longer break than the couple that you get given for a water break. But I'm going to raise two questions and then ask each of the speakers to address them. Several of you and other speakers have talked about whether it was Bill's paper, New England Journal, or Tachi Yamada speaking to industry. I mean, there have been multiple examples of people talking about what would be needed to deal with a pandemic. And these visionary calls for action and investments were largely ignored as a community. Their groups were created, but they lost energy without the pressure of a pandemic. So my first question is, given what you've learned, each of you, what are the key elements that we would need to strengthen for the next pandemic? Because since we didn't plan it 5 years ago, we better start planning it today. My second question I would like you to think about and reflect, and I haven't prepared any of you for this, is we've learned a lot. And some things I have found to be astonishing, whether they were positive or negative, but I'd like you to comment individually. What have you learned in the past 6 months that just surprised you, whether it was a positive or a negative? So thank you. I'd like you to, Clarion's laughing at me. I'd love you to tackle these two questions. Who would like to go first? Frederick.
I'll venture. No, very good questions, Regina. And I think in terms of your first question, I think the challenge here is to use to find the right time to actually put in place the mechanism we need to be ready for the next pandemic, and before sort of we get in, to the phase of this usual cycle of panic and then ignoring the problem too. So, and I think it's quite obvious to me, at least, that what the world has been missing is indeed what we're trying to put in place now, which is a global financing mechanism and some international agreements to back that, so that we get the solidarity in place, rather than this really it's been called a prisoner's dilemma, where each country doesn't really trust that others will behave properly and start entering into these bilateral deals. So I think, you know, the world, and I'm not quite sure whether, you know, this is probably quite idealistic, but I hope that, you know, that will be some of the lessons, and you know, the global leaders are saying the right things, and the question is whether we actually will be able to build on the momentum now to create some institutional preparedness, if I can call it that, including then this global allocation. You know, a lot of these principles could have been thought of before, to be honest, and have been called for before. So I think hopefully we now have the opportunity to do that. In terms of what surprised me, I don't know. I think two things. One is, sorry, there's some background noise. One is the drive to these bilateral agreements has been stronger than I had thought. Shouldn't be surprised probably, but that's one piece, and the other piece is very much more personal, and that's the, you know, all the positive energy that people have demonstrated in getting together in new alliances as we're creating now, and also within just, you know, looking around in CEPI and how people have sort of, you know, rolled up their sleeves and worked day and night and been extremely motivated. It's been really heartening in terms of the world's ability to respond as well.
Thank you. Let's see, Andreas?
Should I go next?
Please.
Yeah, so one thing that I think has been missing, and again, I mean, let me focus on the country level. It's like, do countries have a mechanism to quickly switch into emergency mode? We had, through the World Bank, you know, we had this pandemic emergency facility and so on. And so that's definitely learning from Ebola that in a case of a crisis, of a pandemic, money has to be made available very quickly. And it didn't work out exactly that way. But the other point is that once the money is actually available, it all goes back to the traditional bureaucracy, and there is not some kind of a quick switch to an emergency mode in which you have pre-assigned roles for the different players in the public and the private sector in order to pick up certain pieces of the system and run with them in a predefined way. So that, like, for example, you could think of a separation mechanism where the pandemic patients go into one type of facility and the non-pandemic and non-infectious patients are directed to different facilities, which would have resolved some of the challenges that health systems are facing now, when more people are dying from non-COVID causes because they're not getting proper healthcare anymore, then actually you have death from COVID. So developing these kind of plans for this type of health disaster in countries, and doing some training and some learning about this could be one part of preparation, which is not so obvious as the the global preparation framework. Then what surprised me in a way, and I'm not sure, I mean, I'm not even sure, I don't have any metrics to compare it, but we're all working from home. So basically all our organizations are in a very strange mode that we have never tested before. And we seem to be doing relatively great, amazing things. Yeah, maybe it's time also to rethink the whole global health aid architecture or international organization architecture in their roles, and take the things that worked well in this COVID response, and that's maybe for a year down the road for someone to really analyze and say, what does it tell us about how we should maybe modernize our organizations and the way that we're working together in health on a global scale. I was always frustrated by this redundancy in global health bureaucracies and all the talking that happens day and night with very little action often following, and disconnect with the real world. So that is something that I'm looking at, I'm part of it, I'm wondering. I can't really judge it, but I'm sure something is in it. Something is happening here that we need to understand better. Over.
Thank you. Very wise words, and something we'll continue to both self-examine and I hope examine as a community. Chris.
So, Gina, I'll be brief. But on your first question, first I want to push back a little bit. I don't think the advice coming out from the assessments were ignored. I think that coming out of the Ebola crisis in West Africa, a number of things happened. The world founded CEPI. Gavi was leveraged to create and then deploy the Ebola vaccine that was developed. There have been 3 Ebola outbreaks since that big outbreak in West Africa, and they've all been addressed promptly. The one in Eastern Congo that was declared closed yesterday took a while, but mostly because of security issues, not because of the lack of organization and the courage of the frontline workers. I do think we created the Global Preparedness Monitoring Board, et cetera. And we were arguably prepared, better prepared at the end of 2019 to fight the last pandemic. But a lot of the recommendations, I remember being at the launch of the GPMB report at the UN General Assembly last year, when we could still travel to New York. We did a launch, and I looked out the room, and pretty much everybody in the room was was already convinced, and that's why they came to that event instead of the 15 other competing events. We were not successful in getting people to invest in preparedness for a fast-moving respiratory pandemic, because it was still, yes, history taught us that it was an eventuality. It was when, not if. But given all the other pressing demands, given all of the other resource commitments, giving stagnating levels of overseas development assistance, it didn't make the cut. So I think now, right, because we have shown that we are good at preparing for the last pandemic. So COVID-19, hopefully, will give us the opportunity to break that cycle of crisis and neglect. Now that we've seen the worst pandemic in the last 100 years, in the last 100 years, we'll see if it stacks up against the 1918 one soon. It will motivate action, and we should not miss that moment. And one of the things that Peter Sands said yesterday, and I think we really have to pay attention to, is that we respond to this pandemic in a way that really takes into account the risk of the world. And that, unlike in a different form, I heard Peter refer to HIV as a residual pandemic. We've addressed it in rich countries. Now we still, can always do better, but it became an unequitably distributed pandemic. And we want to make sure that we don't, 2 years from now, have vaccines and drugs and countermeasures that reduce the threat to rich countries and have this still threatening essential health services and other challenges in lower income countries. And I think that's been a theme of today's discussion. I know we're almost at time, so I'll answer your second question about what did I learn. And I think it's very simple. Leadership matters. As you know, Gina, my daughter lives in Thailand. Thailand, if you look at the Hopkins preparedness list, there were about 10 countries that were ranked as very well prepared. Thailand was one of them. But so was the United States, Britain, France, Germany. And Thailand had they had their first infection in the middle of January. And as of yesterday, they had 58 deaths. You compare that to the level of cases and, more importantly, mortality that we've seen in Europe and North America. Leadership matters. That's the key learning here. And the best people have become better, and those who weren't very serious have become exposed.
Thank you for those comments. The comment on leadership also resonates with the discussion about WHO and the areas where they're leading, including the principles and discussions with countries about scarce commodities and for any of the countermeasures that are required. Well, I very much enjoyed this, and that was one of my goals, to have a lot of fun, because it's a great opportunity to take these, to be able to question you where I wouldn't necessarily have that opportunity to do so. I hope I've reflected the sense of the key questions that were coming at me, both from the public and the panel. We could, as I said, we could spend the rest of the day on this, and I would be happy to do so. But now my job is to give you an opportunity for a break. And since I'm time zone challenged, I think we're 2 minutes over. So I would ask Lisa to tell us when we need to get back together. This is a break. And then.
Yeah, so can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, why don't we go for 12:17 p.m. We will reconvene.
Okay, thank you. So the next session will look at how PPP, public-private partnership responses to epidemics, need to define, adapt, and mechanize a broader global health security agenda that builds capacity to address future pandemics. So we sort of previewed the concept. And it will be introduced and moderated by Ambassador John Lang, who is Senior Fellow for Global Health Diplomacy at the UN Foundation. And we will then reconvene and he will introduce the speakers. Thank you very much, everybody. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Gina.
Thank you.
Joe.
Hi, I'm back.
Great to see you. Welcome.
I got a whole new cable. The guy came, he put the whole new cable in outside the house and hooked it up. And it's been great since then, so.
I just recognized you're not in New York. You're out on the island, right?
Yeah, I'm on the beach. I'm at the beach. I've been coming out here every, 2 or 3 weeks just for a mental health break for like 4 or 5 days. So when the Wi-Fi started acting, I mean, it hasn't been great in New York because there's such a demand, at peak hours, there's so many people online, but it got fixed. So I'm back and ready to do what I'm supposed to be doing.
Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Shall I open up the reflections this afternoon since you did yesterday?
Please, please.
Okay, you were so great yesterday. I didn't really want to say anything anyway.
Oh, no, please, Joe. I need you. Thank you.
No, I'm happy to give you a break. Oh dear, this is going really well. It's unbelievable, actually. I was thinking a few minutes ago, I wish some of my students were online,
I just can't get over how just open and comfortable people are in sharing.
Yeah,
I mean, that is just amazing. And I think we may be on, so people are listening to us talk, so I
Indeed,
apologize.
so we're just being complimentary.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, see you soon.
Definitely.
You are live.
Sorry, you did a great job, Regina. Amazing.
And wonderful, wonderful.
So interesting.
Oh, the great questions, the comfort. Thank you. Good afternoon, John.
Hello, Clarion. How are you doing?
Great, sir. Can't wait to, looking forward to your presentation.
Oh, thank you. Although, since I'm the moderator, it's an abbreviated kind of presentation, but
So looking forward to having you with us.
Thank you. Things have been going very, very well, I think.
I pray.
Hey, John, it's good to see you. I haven't seen you in a while.
Yeah, Chris, how you doing?
Good, good.
Very good session this morning. A lot of great points, I thought.
Yeah, it was an interesting discussion. It's too bad that Paul wasn't able to join, because it would have been good to have the pharmaceutical industry perspective.
Yeah, and he's such a good speaker on that.
Mm.
Mr. Lang, do you have any slides?
No, I do not.
Okay, thank you.
But Alex, you know that two of the speakers do.
Yes, indeed. I have them.
All right.
Alex, this is Beth. You have the slides, otherwise I can share screen, whatever is more convenient.
It's more personal preference for you, actually. I don't mind putting them up, and I don't mind letting you put your stuff up. You just let me know which way you want to go about it, and we just got to make sure that if you do it, that you know how to.
Oh yeah, no, I definitely do if it's enabled. I'm happy to do it, no problem.
Okay, perfect. Then I will go ahead and give you privileges so you can do so.
Okay, cool. And if it doesn't work, no worries, fall back. Thanks. Hey, John.
Sounds
how
good.
Are you?
I bet.
And thanks for your help, Alex. Greatly appreciated.
Here, here.
My pleasure.
Hi, Beth. Good to see you.
Alex, sorry, you may have already covered this. Were you addressing the question that came in about a normal meeting? We could walk and talk to each other? Can you facilitate walking around via chat? I think this may have. I don't know if it's possible through this forum.
We can indeed communicate through chat, which would be best.
Okay. I think that this was from the public. I think it's a specific person that wanted to talk to Christine Sizemore. So yeah. Let me see. Christine, are you there? Let's see what we can do. It's now 12:18 as well, folks.
Can we go ahead and start?
So we should reconvene. Let's just make sure Clarion and Joe are ready though, and the others are ready.
Ready.
Great. All right.
Lisa, tell me when I should begin.
Oh, please start now. Absolutely.
All right. Okay, I'm glad we're able to reconvene. Hello, everyone, and thank you for rejoining us after our short break. We've really had a rich discussion with all of our speakers in the earlier sessions. And now we have the opportunity in this last session of the forum to look ahead. And while that was certainly one of the themes of the session just ended, we really want to focus on templates for the future. As many of us in this group have been working on, pandemic preparedness and pandemic response is something that has long been known as necessary because we've had so many pandemics and epidemics, even in just the last few decades, whether you're talking about HIV/AIDS or or SARS, the H5N1 scare, H1N1 pandemic, Ebola in West Africa and elsewhere, and now, of course, COVID-19. There's been a problem of panic and neglect, and several speakers have talked about that, where There are large sums of money put toward the response to a pandemic or an epidemic that begins, and then a few years later, the parliaments and congresses have forgotten about it, and they no longer give the funding needed. Personally, I think this is fundamentally different. This is such a devastating global pandemic that I think there will be some permanent increases in funding. But one of my fears is that it will be the kind of funding that ends up looking backward, that fights the last war, rather than being closer to the all hazards preparedness that we really need to be looking at. So we'll be looking now at mechanisms and templates as to how to deal with this for the future. And I'm sure this will not be the last conversation on that subject. There will be lessons learned exercises probably for years to come as we get out of this COVID-19 pandemic. On the theme of this workshop, the forum itself, the Public-Private Partnership Forum of the National Academies, I did want to point out the generosity of the private sector. The United Nations Foundation, where I work, is one of the fiduciaries for the COVID-19 Solidarity Response Fund. And as of a few days ago, there have been more than $223 million in commitments, much of that from the private sector, but also from over 370,000 individuals. And it's really a tribute to the interests of the public and the private sector and the philanthropic sector to support the work of not only the World Health Organization, but UNICEF, the World Food Program, the Africa CDC, and others who are engaged in this response. So now I'd like to just briefly introduce our speakers and then turn it over to Jeff Sturkio, the first speaker. Jeff is a global health, is president and CEO of Raymond Martin, a global health strategy consulting firm. He used to run the Global Health Council in the United States, and he was vice president of corporate responsibility at Merck and Company and president of the Merck Company Foundation earlier in his career. Beth Cameron is vice president for global biological policy and programs at the Nuclear Threat Initiative. She previously served at the National Security Council under both the Obama and Trump administrations, and she was the senior director for global health security and biodefense. Earlier in her career, she was at the Department of Defense in the United States. Rebecca Martin is the director of the Center for Global Health at the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, and has decades of experience in immunization, HIV, and health system strengthening. She's had overseas assignments for CDC in Kenya, Tanzania, and Denmark, working also with the World Health Organization in those capacities. And Judith Monroe is the president and CEO of the CDC Foundation. Prior to that, she was the deputy director of CDC and director of CDC's Office of State, Tribal, Local, and Territorial Support. And earlier, she was the state health commissioner for the state of Indiana. Those are our speakers as we look to templates for the future. So now let me turn it over to Jeff Sturkio, please.
Well, thanks, John. And it's really a pleasure to join everyone for this, what's been a fascinating and really thought-provoking discussion over the past 2 days. At this point in the program, when we're in the last session, some of you may think that everything important has already been said, but it hasn't yet been said by everyone. So, so just bear with me. I'm going to try not to repeat many of the things you've heard, but I will build on a lot of the conversation that we had both yesterday and today. What I'm going to try to do is I'm just trying to minimize this so I can see the presentation. What I'm going to try to do is to focus on some of the lessons we've learned over the last several years and how public-private partnerships can play a role in issues like pandemic preparedness, and then try to link that to suggestions for future practices by bringing in both universal health coverage and global health security. So if we can take a look at the next slide. I wanted to just start with some opening thoughts that frame the issues that I'll talk about in the next few minutes. You know, some of you may have seen Ken Frazier's recent interviews, and he made a comment about the need to control global pandemics like coronavirus, that until all of us are safe, none of us are safe. Peter Piot talked about his view on why preparedness is important is, and this is just such an arresting metaphor, you don't build a firehouse when your house is on fire. And we've seen a lot of that in the last few months. Also, more generally, and this reaches back a little, as an historian, I've always been intrigued by this comment that General Dwight Eisenhower made in 1950. In preparing for battle, I've always found that plans are useless, but planning is everything. And several speakers today have alluded to that point. And finally, and this channels what Oz C said yesterday about the nature of cooperation in partnerships. Nigel Crisp, in a book he published in 2010 on The World Turned Upside Down, observed that we all have something to learn and we all have something to teach in talking about sort of north-south partnerships in global health. So let's keep those points in mind, and I hope that some of the things I say show why those comments are so relevant to our discussion today. The next slide, please. So one of the most important lessons that's emerged from the early responses to the coronavirus pandemic is the urgent need to work collaboratively across industries and sectors to use the full force of the distinctive capabilities that partners have to tackle this global crisis together. So collaboration, especially through public-private partnerships, is key to ensuring a timely, effective, equitable, and sustainable response. The pandemic has brought into stark relief the fragility of health systems around the world. Even countries with the most sophisticated health infrastructure have been paralyzed by this crisis. I mean, there's no better example than what's happened in the US. As Beth will remind us probably in a few minutes, the Global Health Security Index put the US at the top of the league table, but our behavior as a country has hardly been the kind of behavior that you would expect from somebody who is leading in global health security and preparedness. And while the impact of COVID-19 infections has been widespread, affecting individuals and families and communities in every region of the globe, the health and economic burdens continue to fall disproportionately on vulnerable populations. Now, as with any problem without a passport, to use Kofi Annan's phrase, no actor can tackle a crisis of this magnitude single-handedly. These health threats transcend borders. No nation is immune, nor can any nation address the pandemic on its own. An unprecedented all-hands-on-deck approach is vital to combat the virus and mitigate its damage. The speed with which COVID infections have spread globally has brought a sense of urgency to creating new public-private partnerships to fight the pandemic with new treatments and new vaccines. And we've heard about that from many of our speakers yesterday and today. And I think that leveraging these diverse expertise and technical capabilities will be essential to accelerating immediate actions and, equally importantly, laying the foundation for long-term change to strengthen healthcare systems. You know, we've seen that tackling COVID-19 requires multi-sectoral, whole-of-society solutions. Companies aren't going to be able to do this alone, and partnerships are critical. The global response can and should capitalize on the private sector's expertise and resources, particularly in such areas as health R&D, procurement and supply chain management, data analytics, and manufacturing. And companies large and small are also contributing to ensuring the health and safety of their employees and families and the communities in which they live and work, as well as helping to deal with the social and economic fallout of the pandemic by providing training and economic opportunities for those directly affected. And John alluded to that in his introduction when he talked about the Solidarity Fund and how companies are generously contributing to that. Now, if we can go to the next slide, I wanted to just give some examples of how the COVID-19 infection, which has spread with surprising and unprecedented speed,
Jeff, you're frozen on my screen.
Yes, Jeff, you're frozen.
Yeah, he had some kind of connection interruption. He should be reconnecting at
Yeah.
some point.
Great. Just give him a moment or two.
Yeah, because he's still on the line.
Is he aware that he's frozen?
John, there was a question from the public for you that I sent to you a bit earlier. Please also ask John Lang for more info on the UN fund for COVID-19 he just mentioned. Maybe as Jeff is reloading, you can respond to that.
Yeah, it's called the COVID-19 Solidarity Response Fund. The UN Foundation is the fiduciary for that in the United States, so that the money that we receive for that fund is then given to WHO and other entities that WHO asks that we give the funds to. And I mentioned those: UNICEF, the World Food Program, the Africa CDC. So far, through a couple of days ago, we've dispersed more than $172 million of the $223 million that's been committed. So it's really an effort to show speed and agility to pass that money through quickly. There's a new report that's available on the web for fund disbursements that were made in May. And again, the title of it is the COVID-19 Solidarity Response Fund. Should we, if we still don't have Jeff? Jeff, you're not with us, correct?
That is correct. Jeff is currently not on the line.
Okay, why don't we then move on, I think.
Oh, he just re-answered.
Jeff, are you back with us?
He's getting his audio connected.
If you can hear me, I'm back.
Yay, yes, we can hear you.
Okay, sorry
welcome
about that.
back.
I lost my internet connection for a moment. I hope it stays stable now. So what I was just saying is that you know, we're seeing these unprecedentedly rapid actions in generating new partnerships to develop and test and manufacture new vaccine and therapeutic candidates. Now, other speakers this morning have talked about a number of these examples already, so I won't go into detail. But it really is encouraging that this has happened in just the last few months, and we're already beginning to see serious results coming out of this. I think this level of collaboration is our best hope for limiting the loss of life and long-term social and economic consequences of the coronavirus pandemic. Let's also hope that the coming together we see today as part of this pandemic response is sustained and channeled toward collective investment in emergency preparedness in the future. Indeed, that would be a positive legacy of the coronavirus pandemic. So if we can go to the next slide. I wanted to just summarize some of the lessons about this crisis response that occur to me for not fighting the last pandemic, which Chris and John both observed as something we're getting good at. But let's think about future pandemics. The time to plan is now, not when the next crisis hits. We need to begin thinking seriously about risk mitigation, not just managing current challenges, and also thinking about the possibility of global disruptions. I mean, that's been one of the most difficult parts of the coronavirus pandemic to cope with, that, you know, we tend to think, well, if we can't get PPE here at home, we can always go to a different supplier. But it turned out that the supply chains were disrupted to create more personal protective equipment and ventilators, and also everybody around the world was competing for that limited supply. You know, in addressing these problems without passports, I think we need to invest in multi-sectoral responses that draw on all relevant capabilities and resources. And we have to really realize that building resilient health systems is the best way to sustainability. The example I had in mind here is in a recent book by Ezekiel Emanuel on which country has the world's best health system. he pointed out the correlation between those countries that score well on universal coverage, like Germany, the Netherlands, Norway, and Taiwan, and countries that have coped well with the coronavirus pandemic and are doing relatively well. I don't think that's a random correlation. I think that there really is something there, which is why thinking about universal health coverage is important in this context. Several people have recommended working with communities. That's also critical to bridge the gap between plans and practical action. And as Oz C. observed yesterday, we also have to invest in transparency, good governance, and accountability mechanisms to build trust that will enable long-term and strong engagement. And then if we could go to the next slide. So what might be different in the future? And this is my next to last slide. COVID-19 reminds us, as Dr. Tedros has often observed, that universal health coverage and global health security are two sides of the same coin. So to avoid the cycle of crisis and complacency that CSIS talked about in its report on America's health security last year, we have to, that's characterized our approach to preparedness for decades. We need to really take global health security seriously. One aspect of this is that we're seeing many companies being more vigilant about developing and maintaining plans for business continuity during emergencies, not only protecting employees and their families and communities in the case of health crises, but also natural disasters and conflict situations. And companies are also beginning to frame their sustainability strategies in terms of global health security, which implies greater corporate investments in disease prevention, surveillance, and health infrastructure at global, national, and local levels. So on the last slide, if we could go to that, I think a potential new model for preparedness is an example of the global health security agenda and the role that the private sector roundtable has played in contributing to GHSA. It seems to me that many of the principles that I was talking about come together in this work, and it's a good example of the evolution of global health partnerships in recent years. The private sector roundtable is a coalition of companies from diverse sectors that's designed to catalyze public-private partnerships to enhance the global response. They work closely with partners in the GHSA itself, that is the governments who have come together to work on these issues they have a permanent seat on the steering group, and there's been specific collaboration with the CDC and other bilateral and multilateral agencies. And I'm sure that Beth and Rebecca will touch on this in their presentations as well. And the private sector roundtable supports countries directly by providing expertise, training, and online learning platforms to build global capacity or local capacity. So combined with the long-term presence and engagement of private sector partners helping countries to deal with both the development and implementation of universal health coverage and their response to emerging health crises, this model suggests that we may see continued collaboration in both preparedness and resilience of health systems, which I think augurs well for both the future of global health security and maybe we'll get better at preparing for the next pandemic rather than the last pandemic. So I'll leave it there and be glad to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jeff. Very interesting and raises a lot of issues, which we'll discuss in the Q&A portion. If I could now turn it over to Beth Cameron, please go ahead.
Thanks, everybody. I'm going to just quickly share my screen. And here we go. Is everyone looking at slides? Yes. John, can you see them? Awesome. Great. Okay. Thanks, everybody. So that was a great introduction and really appreciate everything that Jeff just said. I'm gonna hit a couple of points with an emphasis obviously on public-private partnerships, but also hit on a couple of the other great points that have already been made in the portion of the conversation that I heard. I was not able to join yesterday, so if I repeat anything, I'm just gonna apologize for that in advance and try hard to not belabor any particular point for too long. So when I've been thinking a lot about catastrophic biological risks, so to include COVID-19, but something potentially worse, divided into the three categories of health security: naturally occurring, accidental, and deliberate. And I just put this slide up to set the stage and the framing that I agree that we have, when we think about both these categories of biological risks, and when we think about pathogen-specific categories of biological risk, we do often, when we're thinking about the architecture for global health security that we want to see, we are often in a position of fighting the last battle. And so I think it is important to think about not only the types of pathogens and risks that we want to defend against, but also what could potentially be worse, and think about the architecture we're going to need. For example, the ability to pivot to be able to manufacture PPE, drugs and vaccines at scale, and testing capability, which we obviously have suffered from in this crisis. And the goal of health security, of course, to stop outbreaks as close to the source as possible, recognizing that it's not always possible with a pandemic. So I did want to touch quickly on global health security and the global health security agenda, not so much to talk about what it is, but to talk about sort of where we are and where we haven't made as much progress as we'd like, and where we have. You know, really the goal of this effort was to convene a group of countries to agree on similar targets, capabilities that were needed in countries to be prepared for the next epidemic or pandemic. And the agenda was really successful in getting to that point, and then in basically launching those targets under the auspices of the WHO. So being a catalyst to get agreement on targets, which then were taken on by the WHO in the form of the joint external evaluations, the peer reviews that are done to assess IHR implementation, that have now been done in over 100 countries around the world. That then spurred the development of national action plans and specific benchmarks. And I think a lot of great work has been done there, which really has spurred interest around the world in health security, epidemic and pandemic preparedness. I think where we haven't been as successful is in utilizing those plans and that planning process to pull resources from the public and the private sector in a more meaningful way and really synergize our approaches. We haven't been as successful in tracking and accounting for measurable progress, so getting at the accountability points that I know have been raised frequently throughout this conversation. And then we really haven't been successful at surging financing in order to break the cycle of panic and neglect. So I just wanted to start with that sort of where are we with health security and with the global health security agenda. A key challenge, feeding right into what Jeff spoke about, has been our inability to really fully leverage the private sector. And on the right-hand side of the slide is a JEE scorecard that is representative of many countries around the world, with a lot of yellow, some red, and some green, but really no coordinated capability to provide technical assistance to countries to get prepared. And really it's been challenging, I know, for the private sector, despite the great work of the private sector roundtable, to be able to find specific ways to fit in. And so I think a lot more work does need to be done, and we should be thinking about those mechanisms now, even while we're in the middle of this crisis. So some very large challenges remain: limited resources, low domestic budgets for health security and pandemic preparedness, few providers, limited tracking, many countries still not using common metrics for assessing IHR implementation. And this all leads to a lack of collective action. And I think we are all getting a crash course in collective action in the middle of a crisis, which is great. I think the key is really going to be developing institutions that are flexible for the different types of biological risks we might face, both in type of pathogen and in scale and severity, and our ability to use those mechanisms for multiple crises and not lose interest. So I think there's a lot of work to do on developing the architecture that we want to see, and then maintaining it and resourcing it. Jeff, and actually John, sorry, you did mention the Global Health Security Index, which is a partnership between the Nuclear Threat Initiative, the Johns Hopkins Center for Health Security, and the Economist Intelligence Unit. And we did assess 195 countries around the world and published last October the first iteration of the GHS index. The bottom line up front here, while it is true that the United States did score the highest, we got a really low B, and the average overall score was 40 out of 100. It is important to recognize that some countries like Thailand and South Korea, their capabilities were really well utilized. Other countries like the United Kingdom and the United States have a lot of capability, but really didn't leverage that capability. As we prepare for the next iteration of the index, we've been talking a lot about leadership, public confidence in government, and other factors that are clearly important in making sure that capabilities countries do have are well utilized. But Jeff made another important point that I'm actually going to skip to quickly because it relates, which is that health systems overall and their relationship to overall health security are also really important. We saw the average score overall was 40.2 out of 100. When you look at the health systems category, the average score was even lower and was the lowest scoring category in the index with an average score of 26.4 out of 100. So definitely looking at health systems together with specific pieces of health systems that relate to pandemic preparedness more specifically, that's going to be very important, I think, as countries look at preparedness going forward. Our theory of change with the index is really to spur capability and political will and to spark the ability to work across the public and private sector more collaboratively to fill specific gaps and to really hold not only countries but also donors to account for the financing that they do put into global health security. Switching back to other areas that were under prioritized in the index, one of them was a lack of functional health systems. So in several instances, we were able to find evidence that a capability like an emergency operations center existed, but no evidence that it was required to be tested on a regular basis or that there was any regulation or legislation in place to require that. So we did find evidence of existence of systems, but not mechanisms to sort of keep those systems going. We also found that an emphasis on biosafety and biosecurity are under prioritized, and that's important because it's an area of public-private partnership I'll talk about at the end, but also because when you think about what could be more catastrophic than the event that we're currently dealing with, obviously you think of a pandemic influenza that's even more lethal and transmissible, but you also think, or I think, about the possibility for a genetically engineered or synthesized from scratch organism. And in an era where we are trying to surge biotechnology, and we must surge biotechnology to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, we also need to be focused on how to defray against the possibility that we might see an accident or a deliberate event as a result. So some of the key policy recommendations that relate specifically to public and private partnerships that came out of the index, I'm just going to focus on the one that's highlighted here, which is financing mechanisms for health security need to be established. This is not just specific to the index as a recommendation. This was also a major recommendation in the CSIS Commission on Strengthening America's Health Security report. We called it a matching fund. They called it a challenge fund. And I think that's really the language that we've coalesced around. And the World Bank, and I'm not sure if Mohammed spoke about this earlier today, but the World Bank is actually in process of setting up a trust fund that does have a preparedness element in addition to a response element. And I think that's quite an important piece of the architecture. So what I'm going to do for just the next or the last couple of minutes is try to sketch out what we have, and just excuse my imperfect smart art. I'm not the best slideologist, but I did think that this was an important opportunity to try to put on paper what we have and to spur some thinking maybe amongst the group about how the private sector and other sectors fit into this architecture. So if we have the joint external evaluations and national action planning, emphasis from countries to fill the gaps, then we also have some mechanisms for accountability and political will spurring, including the Global Health Security Agenda, including non-governmental partnerships like the index that are measuring progress, like the Global Health Security Challenge Fund concept to finance. We also have the Global Preparedness Monitoring Board serving what I think is a hugely important potential to be a hugely important accountability function in all of this. And I think that as we look at this architecture going forward, as we move through COVID-19 and eventually get to a safe and equitably distributed vaccine, I think it's really important to think about how these things relate to one another and how we can develop them together as a group, and where the private sector and other sectors fit in working with governments. 2 or 3 things that aren't on the slide but should be: CEPI, Gavi, the Global Fund, the other large global health institutions, and obviously the WHO is central. They're not just part of the JEE, they're part of the whole thing. And I think we really need to think about the architecture that we need, in addition to some of the other features that we've found that we're just not prepared for at all in this crisis, like the supply chain that we need, like the biosurveillance capability that we need, for example. Put another way, we need to motivate accountability for action. There's other ideas on this slide in addition to the ones I just mentioned, But I feel like we're not really using our overall UN system to greatest effect. And some of that is frankly because the United States has not been driving the process in the G7 like it could this year. We've not been able to come to agreement in the UN Security Council the way that we normally would. And that's unfortunate. But part of it is also that I think we haven't been ambitious enough in thinking about the architecture that we need for pandemic preparedness and how it fits with the rest of the global health architecture that we have. One of the specific ideas that I wanted to put on the table is that as the World Bank launches the new multi-donor trust fund that it's put forward, it's thinking about, it has announced that it's looking at $500 million, 300 of which will be part of response replacing the cash window, and 200 million of which will be towards preparedness. And I think that is an outstanding start and it should absolutely be fostered. I think this is a great opportunity for other sectors, including the private sector, to think about how they might fit into this concept, how they can incentivize countries to put global health security into their budget lines where possible, and how to better leverage countries' loans from IDA and other financial mechanisms to be able to get prepared. So I think it's a good start, but I think we need a pulling mechanism to bring in other sector dollars to the table. And I do think the time to talk about this is now, not in ways that take away from response funding, but because this is when we have attention of leaders and the private sector in this crisis. And it's therefore, I think, the time to be thinking about what we need. In my last maybe 1 minute, I'll just touch again on the point I made earlier about public-private partnerships in other elements of the global catastrophic biological risk space. One of the things that I worry about normally when we're not in the middle of the pandemic, and maybe especially now that we are in the middle of one, is the really important need to invest in biosecurity and biosafety while we're developing biotechnology and while we're conducting important research during a crisis, why it's so important to work with public and private sector leaders to do that. And I think one example of where there has been a growing public-private sector partnership is through our work with the World Economic Forum, and not just NTI's work. We're really an umbrella for a number of organizations and academic institutions and private sector companies to come together to talk about this in a way that's super constructive, thinking about how tech can really be bolstered while at the same time thinking about building in mechanisms that can make biotechnology safer and more. So think about ways to talk about risks before it becomes much harder to deal with them. So one example is this report that we released with WEF at the World Economic Forum in Davos this year, looking at DNA synthesis screening. Another example is the work that we've done to bring together senior leaders, including the Global Preparedness Monitoring Board, some members of the board, to talk about globally catastrophic biological risks. And I think one element that has been emphasized in that work, and also the work of other partners like the Johns Hopkins Center for Health Security, is how the private sector really needs to be much more actively participating in those tabletop exercises and practicing in advance. So in my last slide, well, I don't want to skip Africa CDC, sorry. I do want to call out Africa CDC here as an organization that has been incredibly collaborative and thoughtful about how it's developed partnerships with non-governmental actors like our organization, but also with the private sector and its work on COVID-19 and on pandemic preparedness in general. We've been working with them on biosafety and biosecurity, but the way that they've been looking at this, that specific issue, I think, is indicative of how they've been looking at some other private sector and public sector partnerships, where they've built a strategy that's quite thoughtful, and they've thought a lot about how to fit in elements within that strategy, where we're developing a piece on biosafety and biosecurity that fits in with our laboratory plan. So we're essentially serving as a spur for the work that they're already doing to ultimately strengthen regional capability. And I think a lot can be learned about some of the great work that John Nkengasong and others have done to build that effort, with a lot of partnership from many folks who are here. And I know John spoke yesterday. So I'll stop there and look forward to your Q&A. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Beth. A very rich discussion of key biosafety, biosecurity, and global health security issues. Now let's turn it over to Rebecca Martin, the Director of the Center for Global Health at CDC. Rebecca?
John, and it's been a great 2 days, so I really appreciate the discussions that we've had. You can hear me okay? A thumbs up? Okay, great, thanks. 2 thumbs up, okay. I just want to give a little bit of a plan for our discussion today. So I'm just going to do a few minutes about CDC's role, and then Judy Monroe will talk about CDC Foundation. And then we want to spend the last 10 minutes of our time having a little bit of a discussion about mechanisms past, present, and future a bit. So we're hoping that this will work and trying this different mechanism on Zoom, but trying to keep everybody engaged and move forward. So thanks again for the opportunity to be here today to be part of this. Yesterday, June 25th, ended the 10th Ebola outbreak in the Democratic Republic of Congo. It was the first time where vaccines had been used throughout the outbreak, and there were different testing of antivirals as well. And the effort now is on sustaining what has been developed through the outbreak response, but moving forward, what's needed for the country to many other built and what we need to continue to sustain. I also appreciated the comments yesterday of yesterday as well from Peter Sands about the definition of collaboration and agreeing that it is that sort of shared common interest that's so important. I also agree that I heard yesterday from Alan Knight on that private sector is underengaged and called upon many times during an outbreak, but what's being done in the interims during the times as Beth referred to as the panic and neglect periods. And then also that I think it was Regina that mentioned the importance of that private sector is more than financing. It is an important opportunity, and I hope we will go through our examples to talk about what we can do together and what is needed, and what are some of the mechanisms for the future as well. So I'm really excited to be here with Judy, who has with the foundation, we have such a unique partnership, and where she's taken the foundation, I'm sure she'll go into more detail, but it's just been fabulous to work with her. And I know we're going many places in the future as well with her ideas and efforts. So CDC, we have many different types of partnership, but in country, our natural partner is government to government. So it is Ministry of Health. But we work regionally and globally also through partnerships with indigenous and international non-governmental organizations. We also work with bilaterals and multilaterals, academic institutions, and of course the private sector. And we do need the private sector to stay in the entire time, and not just for outbreaks, but really how do we ensure the engagement continually? And that's also in country and globally. I think we tend to see different ways of how this works, but we definitely need private sector in countries to also be engaged in these efforts. We work and partner to strengthen public health infrastructure and what are needed for resources for public health infrastructure to prepare and respond to public health threats. We see that the funding for that continues to ebb and flow. And with that, we worry about the continued sustainability. We know, and there are many data out there to show that preparing and preventing disease outbreaks is the most effective and cost-efficient way in order to we can sure to stop epidemics and pandemics going forward. And when I talk about developing public health infrastructure, what do I mean? We strongly work to establish national public health institutes in countries. These are the homes where surveillance and laboratory, the public health workforce, incident management systems, and implementation science can come together under one roof. And when there are changes in government, that it can withstand the changes such that the structures that have been built can continue to be sustained and maintained. And there is much role for this with the private sector, as we heard yesterday. So I want to go through just a few examples of the private sector importance of this with our collaboration. And as William Shakespeare said, the past is prologue. So I really do think that this is the opportunity to learn and to continue to say and plan what we're going to be seeing and not what we have seen. And we heard from Alan Knight yesterday about the private sector resource mobilization roundtable for Ebola in West Africa, the importance of the advocacy and communications with their staff, who then went into communities and talked about some of the preventive measures and also how to prepare. And this was critically needed. Also the supply chain and how to move test kits, how to move supplies and logistics, the logistics to be able to have a supply chain. And then lastly, as we've heard, the technology and medical countermeasures. Ebola vaccines were introduced, diagnostics, the rapid diagnostic testing was introduced as well. And these are all very critical pieces that we need to have and continue to need in going forward. The other pieces of that, I think, and that are still needing further strengthening are looking at the reporting and the data and getting the private health sector engaged. And Peter Sands mentioned this yesterday, and I want to give a few examples in a moment of this, but we have public health sector reporting to government, not always the private health sector. And so bringing those data together so that they can be looked at one source is really critical in moving forward to being able to know what's happening and what will happen. Jeff mentioned the Global Health Security Agenda Private Sector Roundtable as well. And our role in working in that was the introduction with the Minister of Health in Uganda, Jana Cheng. And from that, there was an MOU developed, but working closely with the CDC Foundation, we were able to ensure that not only was there funding available for public health workforce, but also the private sector roundtable put in a communication expert, embedded that in the Ministry of Health to help them develop communications, both risk and crisis communications that were needed. And also, the engagement we've helped with is within the National Action Plans for Health Security. We see a strong role for private sector in developing and in carrying out the National Action Plans for Health Security in each country. We have engaged to make sure that the private sector could serve as observers in the joint external evaluations and bring forward ideas. In Rwanda, there have been many opportunities to move efforts of this forward. So I'm going to switch a bit now and just talk a little bit about COVID-19 before I wrap up my remarks and hand over to Judy. But I think the most important is recognizing, and we've heard this, and we heard it from the Global Preparedness Monitoring Board, needing a whole of society and a multi-sectoral approach based on science and evidence to prepare and respond to public health emergencies and threats. And with our work in CDC, we've been able to leverage public health capacities that we've built through the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief and HIV, the laboratory testing and diagnostics, the use of the platforms for COVID-19 have been put in place. Our work in field epidemiology training program, building the disease detectives and the public health workforce for this, we have seen that the FETP has been leading in Vietnam, Sierra Leone, Uganda, and many other countries where they can quickly move in and have that expertise. Infection prevention and control work that we've done in India with private health sector on TB in private hospitals. These trainings have now been shared more broadly and have been more done also through electronic means to be able to share how to do trainings on infection prevention and control. And then the contact tracing. Both the TB surveillance and the polio surveillance networks have provided extreme amount of support for ensuring that contact tracing can occur in countries. And Sierra Leone, for example, has done an amazing job of being able to do every case has had a contact tracing through it, and it's been able to sustain that. If the epidemic continues to increase, we'll see if that continues, but they have been able to move forward on it very rapidly and in a very steady and standard way. And then lastly, the emergency operations centers for bringing that coordinated response. Beth mentioned that many countries have these, but are they exercised? Are their muscles flexed? And we've seen some countries where this has been able to build off the work that we've done in global health security. For example, in Vietnam, where they have been able to bring all of their down to the very lowest level to the national level to share data and information across borders, across the provinces, so that they can act quickly and respond rapidly. Just lastly, the issue of the essential health services. I think this is something that in our work in malaria, TB, vaccination, and building public health infrastructure. We have worked hard to make sure that these services can be leveraged for COVID-19, but we can't neglect these, and we need to figure out how to deliver these in times of pandemics as well. And this is something we are now working with host country governments to talk about and establish. So as we think about the future, the issues of vaccines and diagnostics and workforce, data will be critical. And as we've heard, the importance of community will continue to be a very important piece going forward. As we move into Ebola outbreak number 11 in DRC, we are bringing what has been learned in the eastern part of the country, but we must sustain these efforts so it's not each time responding to an epidemic or even a pandemic as we go forward. So I will stop there and hand over to Judy and then look forward to our discussion. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Rebecca. Great to be with all of you. So for those not familiar with the CDC Foundation, we are an independent 501c3, a nonprofit, but we were created by Congress. So we're in that unique space like the NIH Foundation, but of course we support CDC and the public health field. And work to extend the life-saving work of CDC and the health departments and the global work. So our work is focused on building these partnerships between CDC and the philanthropies and the organizations. And our tagline at the foundation is "Together our impact is greater." So I think that's very appropriate for this meeting. And we deeply believe that. Everyone at the foundation really works hard to align diverse interests and leverage all the parties' unique strengths to build collaborations that do drive greater impact and more than any one entity could do. But we also know from our experience, it takes a lot of work. This is not easy work to build the relationships, to build the trust for those long-term partnerships that really do yield the long-term impact. So we've had 25 years as an operating foundation. In that time, we've launched more than 1,000 programs. We manage hundreds of programs each year in about 140 countries. And our partnerships have helped CDC launch new programs. We've expanded existing programs, and we established pilot projects. The creation of the CDC Foundation, you may not be as aware of the history. It actually was based on the vision of several prior CDC directors. And these directors knew the challenges that society faced could not be addressed by any one entity or sector alone. But most notably, Dr. Bill Foege was one of those directors. And he, of course, came up with the strategy of the ring containment model that he'd learned in the fighting forest fires in the Pacific Northwest that led to the strategy to eliminate smallpox. But he knew how important it was to have all kinds of partners coming together to have the impact, and he saw the power of breaking down the silos between sectors. He also was a key figure in one of the largest public-private partnerships ever created, and that, of course, was back in 1987 when the CEO of Merck made the historic announcement that his company would donate Mectizan to anyone needed for as long as it was needed to eliminate river blindness. Dr. Foege did that apart from others that had declined that offer. And then yesterday, Trevor Gunn with Medtronic talked about how the structure of public-private partnerships will continue to change. And one of the points that he made was going from tactical to strategic. That really resonated with me when I heard that, because the CDC Foundation's early work and our journey started with really transactional work. But over the years, we've been moving to become more and more of a strategic partner and to think strategically, both with CDC and with our private partners. We'll be talking more about it, but one of our first really robust strategic planning retreats was with Rebecca and the Center for Global Health a few years ago. So moving to the pandemic today, a little bit about what we've done. So the CDC Foundation, during an emergency, we will activate our emergency response fund to respond to the emergency after the CDC has activated their emergency operations center. Now, we are not an endowed foundation, and so we have to raise the money when we activate a fund. But in the wisdom of the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation a few years ago, they pre-position funds in an emergency account, works a bit like a donor advised fund. And so on a Sunday afternoon, when I'm talking to the leadership of CDC about activating our fund, I also was emailing RWJF leadership saying, would you like to mobilize some of those resources that are already in our account to do this. So when we came out with our press release, which was the first, we were the very first in the nation to announce an emergency fund for the US for this novel coronavirus, we came out of the gate with the first $1 million with RWJF funding. I think it's a tremendous model, much of what I've heard in this meeting. So then we spent January and February trying to alert donors about the need to get in front of this threat. But I will tell you, not a lot happened. Late January, February, the donors weren't coming forth. They were listening, but there was skepticism. And it took the community spread here in the United States, in Seattle and Bay Area and so forth, before we started seeing a tsunami, honestly, in March, of philanthropy and private sector starting to come forth. So we were pleased with that, but it's a story of philanthropy in the private sector not always moving as fast as they can, even though they have greater ability than government many times. So we have many stories, however, during COVID, and I hope this will be the future, where a number of foundations here in the US have been, in fact, expediting their usual processes with their boards or whoever, whatever their process is internally to be able to mobilize funding. So I really hope on the other side of this, we move that to the new model, that expedited funds during an emergency. And the other thing that I would point out, we have been really pleased with the number of private sector partners that have come to us at the CDC Foundation that we have never engaged with, and they have never engaged with public health. In fact, they were pretty tone deaf regarding what was happening in the world at large when we talk about global health security. And so we've awakened, I think, with COVID, many donors and partners. So we have these numerous new private sector partners and global companies that also have expressed interest in long-term relationships. So I'll talk a moment about relationships and how some of the things we've learned at the foundation. I've been invited to speak to some of the boards of these companies because of COVID, but I've also been asked to speak with some of their employees and the employees' families, now in the age of Zoom. And I've joined all hands. I've been surprised at some of these invitations, but you begin to realize the long-term relationship that you want to have. This is really gold to build that kind of a relationship. And we know that employees like to see their companies supporting humanitarian and public health work. So it can be a real win-win. I'll give you an example. This morning, I was on a call with a private sector partner. They had a team on the call. We had a team from the CDC Foundation, and we had some CDC experts. And we worked together problem solving. And the problem that we were trying to solve this morning was CDC guidance is terrific, but it can be very dense, it can be very detailed, and we need practical ways to apply that in the field. CDC is based in science. They give in their guidance, they give the what, the why, the who, the where, but the how is the nitty gritty, and that really needs the users involved. You need the users' voices behind that. So this was a company that did make a donation to COVID, but now they're going to give us their expertise and employee time to help design and build practical tools for some of the CDC guidance. And we also will have the users involved in making sure that's practical. Then earlier this week, I had a call with another partner about the company's technical expertise, and they are now considering the secondment of a team for 6 months to come to the CDC Foundation to be able to help CDC and health departments across the nation with their highly technical team and expertise that everybody actually needs, but health departments and CDC do not have it. And so those are some examples that we're beginning to see that we can move this public-private partnerships forward from our vantage point. Setting goals together, regular meetings, updates. We do have a firewall. A private company cannot influence the science coming out of CDC, but boy, when it comes to that practical application of that guidance, everybody needs to be on board. So I'll stop there with the one last comment. Some of the things we've been able to do during this response, we've moved really fast at the foundation because we do have speed and agility. And I've really come to believe that trust is what we need. I've said many times that the only thing I know that moves faster than the virus is trust. And the things that we've been able to move really fast and be able to help on the ground the public health response have all been built on trusting relationships from years in the making. So I'll end there, and Rebecca, turn back to you.
John, I know we're over, so we maybe just give,
yeah.
if you'll give us a few minutes, if that's all right, to just maybe give a present and future. Okay, I'm getting
Sure.
two thumbs
Go
up. I like those thumbs. Okay, thank you. So just as you've heard from both of us, I think that working together, the sum of our parts is greater than being individual. And as we have been able to do so much more having the partner of the CDC Foundation. And maybe I'll skip the past in the interest of time, but maybe focus on the present. And Judy mentioned how we've done joint strategic planning, looking at 6 countries, of really seeing how we can come together through private-public partnerships and understanding where we can move forward on ensuring preparedness and response, looking at the National Action Plan for Health Security and strengthening that. And from our perspective, we've brought our technical experts together in our country offices through our presence in over 60 countries. We have brought our people together to be able to meet and discuss with the local and the country level private sector. And then from Judy's perspective, I'll stop and maybe let her add, in terms of what bringing to the partnership and how they've been able to work with us on this. Over.
Yeah, so the CDC Foundation, we're very broad because we support the entire agency. So the beauty of this strategic planning was to take the foundation and have agreement with Rebecca's team that we would have a focus. And then that way I've been able, my team at the foundation, both from the advancement side, bringing resources in, and our programmatic side, they've been able to really focus. I also, back in the days when we were traveling, I personally have traveled to the countries, the priority countries that have been identified, so that I knew the players on the ground. And then the other thing I would mention is we also took our board, because of this, the importance of the global health security agenda, we had a retreat with the board of directors for the CDC Foundation in October and really moved them to adopt priorities for the board, which then will drive my time. And we came out of that with health security and data modernization as being the 2 big priorities for the foundation to work with CDC and partners. And then kind of surrounding both of those, or cross-cutting, is innovation, that we want to have an eye toward innovation in both of those areas. So it's been really good. Got to have the focus.
And then I think, just thinking about the future, Judy, I'm really excited about your board. And as you said, they've made global health security one of their priorities. And we've been thinking together, Judy, as you know, about what could that mean for us thinking about the future and how we could think about partnerships and what role your board could play in thinking about sharing of talent, allowing for flexibility, and allowing the focus on science, and thinking about what we're trying to do at country level in building capacity for preparedness and response, and then also thinking at regional and globally, especially around the issues that you've mentioned around data, real access to data, but then also, information systems, so that data can be used by all and not have 10 different systems trying to be utilized in one outbreak in one country. So just really excited about the opportunity with your board, and I wanted to see if you want to add any more on thinking on that as well. Over.
Yeah, the really great thing that has happened, we've all talked about COVID being an accelerator. We could not have selected 2 priorities that were more pertinent to the COVID pandemic. And so the board all sees the wisdom in having defined priorities. And that's driving actually how we're thinking about new board members to come on. What expertise do we want on our board that will help drive these priorities? It's also helping the board really concentrate and think about, who are the donors, who do they have in their network? And so we're seeing our board open their networks more broadly, and greater opportunities, both on the funding side, the partnership side, and the thought leadership side.
And then I'll just wrap up by saying, I wasn't going to go to the past, but I think it's important. Judy and I went to West Africa last summer and visited Guinea, Liberia, and Sierra Leone, and seeing what the foundation had been able to do quickly in helping build surge capacity in building emergency operations center through partnerships, that those are still in existence and are being used today for COVID-19 shows that what has been done is sustainable and can continue. And we're looking forward to thinking about new ways of doing this more. So I'll wrap up, and Judy, if you have one last comment, I'll hand over it to John.
Yeah, thanks. No, I would just say that the West Africa trip was really rich for the CDC Foundation, because we were able 5 years later to see that those items that had been, whether it was training or vehicles or computers or EOCs that the foundation donors had invested in, that gives us a really strong story when we go either back to those donors or go to new donors. So it was a great trip.
Okay, thank you very much, Rebecca and Judy. I really appreciate that, and obviously an impressive level of cooperation between the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention and the CDC Foundation. Very interesting. We now have 20 minutes left before we'll have to wrap this up and turn it over to the co-chairs of this forum for closing remarks. And I'd like to pick up on something that Jeff said at the beginning when he quoted Dr. Tedros as saying universal health coverage and global health security are two sides of the same coin. And I like that phrase, but I'm not sure it's true. And I'd like to just really delve more deeply into this. Let me just explain an experience that I had. When I was the special representative on avian and pandemic influenza at the US State Department from 2006 to 2009, I gave many speeches on the criticality of preparing for a potential pandemic. We were then most concerned about the H5N1 virus, which was killing millions of poultry, and the concern was that it would mutate and form sustained and efficient human-to-human transmission. But it was broader than that in terms of our approach and the need for pandemic preparedness. But in my Foreign Service career, I had experiences living and working at U.S. embassies in West Africa, East Africa, and Southern Africa, and I basically had a pretty good impression of the mindset of a Minister of Health from Sub-Saharan Africa. And when I was telling them the importance for them to prepare for this potential pandemic, I always thought that in the back of their minds, they were thinking, I have people dying every day from HIV/AIDS, tuberculosis, malaria, measles, or being paralyzed for life from polio. And you want me to prepare for a pandemic that may or may not be severe and may or may not happen in the next decade or two. I can't make that a priority. And they would never tell me that, but you could almost tell by their actions that they weren't making it as high a priority as we had hoped they would. And so my question to each of the panelists is, how do you see the link between the emphasis that many in the world and many in the last 2 days have placed on global health security, pandemic preparedness and response, and that broader effort to create strong health systems and universal health coverage? Because funding is limited, and even if there's an increase in funding as a result of COVID-19, it will still be limited. Where should a health minister put that money? And what are those real links? So if I could start with our first speaker, Jeff, if you have any comments on that.
Sure, John. It's you've really put your finger on a key challenge in thinking about these issues. Certainly most, I'm sure, we've all spoken to health ministers and gotten that same vibe that, they're beset with challenges. They don't have enough money. They don't have enough health workers. People are dying. It just looks pretty bleak. But actually, the reason I quoted Tedros and the reason I think that he's onto something is that if health ministers and the health system itself is making the right investments to deal with the challenges they have today by investing in strengthening primary care, which will help them with a wide range of non-communicable diseases as well as things like maternal and child health. If they will put money into building the healthcare workforce to deal with these challenges, if they'll make establishing firmer financing for the entire system So you could go down the list. All of those investments will actually help make sure that when there is a challenge from a new pandemic, the system's actually better prepared to cope with it. And so it's not so much that you can either invest in a new pandemic or deal with the challenges you have today. It's that the investments you make can actually help you do a better job of dealing with both sets of challenges. And that's what I think people are coming to understand better as they, as the global health security agenda has taken hold. Because through the action packages that countries are working on, and with the insights that come from the joint external evaluations, you can identify those areas that will strengthen current response. And by doing that, you also make it possible to have a more resilient health system in the face of a crisis. So I do see them as two sides of the same coin. And that's what, but I also understand your skepticism based on engagement with health ministers who are so pressed by today's challenges that they can't step back and think about the longer term. And that's where the kind of collaborations that all of us have been talking about are important, because they can help frame the issues in a way where the officials who are coping with today's challenges can see that they can do both. It's not that they have to choose one or the other.
Very interesting. Very good points too. Beth?
Yeah, so I agree 100% with what Jeff just said, and I would only just add one example. So in the Global Health Security Index, we made an explicit decision to include a category that has broader health system related indicators, in addition to the categories that are roughly prevent, detect, and respond, that correspond more closely to the questions in the joint external evaluation. And we did that specifically so that leaders could look at the broader health system, so numbers of doctors and nurses, access to healthcare related questions, community health related questions, and actually start to understand the relationships and look at the data to understand the relationships between health security and broader access to care and universal health coverage. Recognizing that there are definitely some overlaps there, but looking at sort of what we've been calling the indicators of health security in the context of the broader care. And one thing that I think is really apparent, at least to me, in looking at the COVID-19 crisis, is how countries that don't have a right to access to healthcare, including the United States, and the way that we've viewed universal health coverage here, and how we haven't done as well in some cases. So I think, in looking at the relationship between pandemic preparedness and broad public health, broad healthcare and broader public health systems, being clear about what we're actually measuring and how the things relate to one another is important. The one thing that I would also say, John, just a sort of a related point, is that I think that the conversation about health security can be helpful in bringing other leaders into the conversation about universal health coverage and health systems in general, by talking about what we need to be prepared for the longer term threat. You can get sometimes heads of state to the table, sometimes ministries of foreign affairs and ministers of defense that aren't as usually focused on the broader healthcare system, and be able to bring them to bear in the conversation. And I guess the final point I'd make, just because I think this is an important group to make it with, is that I don't think that we should call everything universal health coverage, or that we should say that health security and health system strengthening are equivalent. I think what we need to do is start talking about what are the pieces of the broader health system that relate more specifically to pandemic preparedness. How do they relate to the broader public health system, and how do those relate to access to care related issues, so that we can start to understand how these things relate to one another, so that people can make an informed decision about where to put the next dollar. Because you're right, finances are limited, but until people start to be able to map specific indicators related to those issues, I'm afraid that sometimes in the policy conversation, there becomes this tension between UHC and global health security. And I don't think that tension should be there. It's not an either or, it's obviously an and.
Very good, thank you. Rebecca?
Well, thank you, Beth, for that tee up. I appreciate that. Because I fully agree with you. There's definitely things in healthcare system related to prevention. And I think that's the main thing, is versus looking at what's invested in building more hospitals. How can you build more primary healthcare facilities and have then referrals to tertiary hospitals, care and so forth. But there is, if you look at that, a lot of overlap. If we're talking about healthcare workers in a health facility, they're the same ones doing surveillance and reporting to a public health infrastructure. There are the data that need to be sent both from private and public facilities, the laboratories and surveillance that I've mentioned. So all of these require a very interlinked area of work, and it does exist, but it does need to be strengthened. So I think this is critical. And as Beth said, I mean, bringing people to the table, what in other sectors, the economy, commerce, travel, trade, these are important pieces of how to talk about prevention and making sure that we can have that discussion. And I think with CDC, our work in vaccines and in HIV, TB, really bring opportunities and some of the non-communicable diseases to think about how to build this primary healthcare system for the future that is part of a health security response as well will be really critical.
Thank you, Rebecca. Judy? You're on mute.
Unmute, okay. So everybody's been very eloquent and really covered the main points. The only thing I would add is, if we go back to H1N1, and I'm going to speak for experience as the state health officer, during H1N1, we were real time exercising pandemic preparedness. And there were certain things that during that pandemic that I remember as health officers thinking, we've got to keep these alive and well. We've got to use them for either chronic disease or other infectious disease, because if we're not keeping the health security top of mind, the pandemic preparedness, everybody knowing what their roles are, keeping the lines of communication, et cetera, we're not going to be prepared. So it's here in the United States as well. So I would just stop there. It's not just around the world.
All right, thank you. In the planning for this two-day forum workshop, we had been discussing among the planning committee the idea of governance frameworks. And of course, in the sense of the issues that we're talking about here and the broader point of global health security beyond the specifics of COVID-19, one of the things that one of the major frameworks that has come up is the international health regulations and the obligation of China to inform WHO of the potential public health emergency of international concern, which it did on December 31st, and the actions that took place as a result after that. So you have that in place, the IHR. It's been approved by 196 states parties, which is actually 2 more than the total number of member states in the World Health Organization. So it is truly universal, but there are a fair number of people who are talking about the need to revise it and change it and improve it as one of the efforts in the future. But our theme for these 2 days is really the role of public-private partnerships. And one of the questions our planning committee asked was, should there be some new entities and more official entities created that include the private sector for pandemic response and preparedness? This is something that we've heard Peter Sands and others talk about earlier in this forum, and certain multilateral organizations work more easily with the private sector than others. But I wondered if you folks had any comments about future possible governance structures that we haven't so far discussed, and also if you have any closing comments, because at this point we've got 7 minutes left, and I'd like to let each person have an opportunity to make a closing comment as part of this. So please go ahead, and again we'll start with Jeff.
Sure, thanks, John. It's a really interesting question, and obviously, there's an entire academic journal devoted to global health governance. So, there are many people who've been discussing this for many years. I think let me just come at this from a slightly different angle. I think the most important thing that can be done is to encourage governments to think about the resources they have to combat, whether it's a new pandemic like coronavirus or just everyday quotidian challenges that they face in their health system, to think of it in the way, in using the phrase that Rebecca used, of whole of society. There's in a lot of conversations I've had with health officials over the years, particularly in lower and middle income countries, they tend to look at how to meet the challenges they face as if the only resources they have are the public sector resources. But every country has civil society and private sector resources that can help deal with the health challenges they face either now or prospectively. And if we just got into the habit of planning on a whole of society basis, many countries would find that they actually have much more to deal with than they do just with their own, tax-based budgets and bilateral and multilateral ODA. So that would be a mindset that would actually help us deal with these questions better. And in the context of that, there should certainly be rules of the road for engaging with civil society and the private sector in approaching these questions of financing and programmatic interventions in many of the ways that we've talked about. The other thing that I would also recommend thinking about is that I don't think we need new institutions. What we just need to do is make sure that the institutions we have are fit for purpose. And I'll just give one other example there. You mentioned both Gavi and the Global Fund Against AIDS, TB, and Malaria. They are more effective at bringing all of these resources together than the WHO is, because they don't have something like FENSA, which actually acts as a barrier to engagement with non-governmental actors. Both the Global Fund and Gavi have private sector representatives on their board. They have civil society representatives on their boards, and that brings a variety of perspective and an orientation toward collaboration that is different than the WHO. Just one last comment. When I was the head of the Global Health Council, I actually was asked to participate in some of the discussions around WHO reform at the time. And I remember whenever there would be a consultation that Margaret Chan would raise, and she was really trying to be more inclusive of the private sector and civil society, there were government representatives around the table who would be quietly snoozing through most of the conversation until that question came up. And all of a sudden they would sit bolt upright and object to the inclusion of the private sector and civil society because the WHO is an intergovernmental organization. So there are deep-seated prejudices around this that, when Gavi and the Global Fund were set up, they could have been part of WHO. And in fact, there were those who argued they should be, but I think they wisely decided to set up a different kind of organization so that there wouldn't be those barriers to greater collaboration. So those are just 2 points in response to your question.
Very good, thank you. Beth?
Yeah, I'll make just a couple of specific recommendations, and maybe the only thing that I would say that's slightly provocative is that I actually do think we need some new, maybe institution is the wrong word. We need some new. There are some new public-private organizations that I think we need, and happy to be debated on that. We certainly need to strengthen the ones we have as well. So first, I think that we did not have a fit-for-purpose global mechanism to surge, and we still don't, in my opinion, although it's starting to be, we're starting to get one, the supplies that we needed for COVID-19, to include personal protective equipment, masks, but also to include reagents and tests. And I think that on a regional basis, at least, there should be mechanisms to pivot production capability to allow for that to happen, and to not just rely on stockpiles or any specific country. And I think that there's been some great work that has been spearheaded in Africa out of the African Union and with Africa CDC, and I do think we need new institutions to do that. The Pandemic Supply Chain Network was a great beginning to that conversation, but honestly, I don't think that we did what we needed to do as a world. And I wasn't at the table, and I'm certainly not throwing anyone under the bus. We just weren't prepared. That's pretty clear. Second, on biosurveillance capability, there's been so much great innovation between the public and private sector on disease surveillance data, different ways to integrate it, incorporate it, improve data, modernize data. I think there does need to be an organization, an entity somewhere that is looking at biosurveillance data regularly, taking some of the work of these great dashboards that have brought together experts, the best data analytics experts in the world with the best public health experts in the world, and created that. And I think we do need one that's international and does something like a global forecasting center would do. There's been a number of conversations about that, including a great recommendation that Wendy Taylor put together coming out of a Bellagio meeting 2 years ago that I had the pleasure of participating in. But I think we need something like that to blend public and private data sets more effectively for every outbreak that's emerging. I do think we need the multi-donor trust fund at the World Bank that's being stood up for global health security. I think we also need additional mechanisms to challenge public and private sector donors, and not just to put in money. I do want to clarify that point, but to be able to help countries with their national action plans and to be part of that process the way that the Global Health Security Agenda Private Sector Roundtable is pioneering. And then finally, I think that we do need a national and a global conversation about triggers for acting fast in an emergency at that point in time when it's completely unclear, that point in time that Judy referenced, where it's very hard to get anybody at the table, decision makers, private sector, whoever, because what we really need to do is act when we don't know how big a deal something's going to be and in the absence of information. I think as those triggers start to be discussed in the WHO context, the IHR context, and the national context, we're definitely going to need the private sector to be part of that conversation, because they're going to need to be taking risks, and there needs to be ways for the public and private sector to talk about how those risks will be taken, recognizing that there will be mechanisms to pay for that, and to recognize that we will be over prepared, and that that's the only way we'll stop a pandemic from having the impact that this one is. Over.
Thanks very much, Beth. I like that idea of being over prepared. Far better than being under prepared. Rebecca, please go ahead.
Thank you. And Don, I just want to hit on your IHR comment, because while they're in place, there is no sort of bite or teeth to them such that there can be, it's not poor, especially with the Ebola outbreaks, that we have been able to respond. And yes, we know, and this, they can take a few actions, but I think that there has to be looking at what different authorities there could be put in place to help strengthen the IHR. And then, as Beth said, I think the data, bringing private and public sector data together is really critical for having that overall picture that needs to happen, looking at, from climate to what's happening in economies, so many data and forecast. My second of third points I wanted to make was at the country level, importance there of having ownership of this with countries down from community level. That requires trust in the community, engagement of communities all the way to the national level for accountability. And civil society is a great partner to think accountability within governance in a country, of how they could be engaged to go forward on. And then my last is a little bit on, looking at the access to COVID-19, some of the diagnostics. What we saw in Asia was countries making their own and being able to respond quickly. Well, they learned this in SARS and have had the capacity and been prepared for this. What we need to see is something like this in Africa as well. So while we're trying to find ways to get tests for countries in the African continent, we also need to start thinking about building the capacity for future, that they can have their own tests be performed and be built in on the continent, so that they can be better prepared to respond more quickly and have access to all of the requirements of the diagnostics and PPE in the future. And I think the Africa CDC is looking at this as well. So while we're trying to find tests for countries, we also need to find ways of, in a region, building that capacity that can be surged when needed, both for the testing and for the manufacturing capabilities. Over.
Thanks very much, Rebecca, and thanks also for raising the importance of civil society. It's not the theme of this forum workshop, but it's certainly a very important element all around the world. Judy?
Yeah, so I certainly agree with the other speakers, and this idea of a new governing body or organization. whatever is created, I would just say that we need to remember that culture eats strategy for lunch, and the different sectors do not always speak the same language. The drivers are different. And so whatever organization it is, I think that needs to be front and center, to be sensitive on the front end and be proactive about making sure everyone aligns around their the culture, if you will. And then the other thing I would build on is the power of the private sector to come in. We really need to harness data for predictive analytics, and I think that's incredibly important. And getting there again will not be easy, but we've got to build on all the successes that have been out there. So with that, yeah, I'll wrap up because I know we're, I think, at time. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Judy. It's an interesting theme that we've had from several of you, is the importance of the data for all of this. My apologies to some of the people who submitted questions that we weren't able to get to. There were discussions of corruption and the impact that has, discussions of how do you really define universal health coverage, and how much of that is an emphasis on tertiary hospital care versus primary health care. We weren't able to get to all of those. My apologies to the participants. We've gone 5 minutes past our time, so I beg forgiveness from our co-chairs, Joe and Clarion, but I really think this is a very rich discussion, covered a lot of the important issues. I think that it won't be the last discussion of templates for the future following COVID-19, but it certainly was a very strong basis for so much of what will happen in the future. So thanks to all of our speakers, and a round of applause from the whole group. Trust me on that, because you won't hear anything, but we really appreciated all of your work. Please, if I could turn it over to Clarion and Joe, and now we see Joe on the screen.
Thanks very much, John. That was great. And thank you so much for all your hard work in helping us put this together. Since I've been disconnected off and on the last couple of days, I'm going to try to start sort of hitting some high points and wrap up, and then turn it over to Clarion for final words. It's been an incredibly rich discussion, and I just want to thank everybody, not only for their expertise, but for the kind of really frank discussion and their openness to really being self-critical, as well as engaging and helping us identify not only the strengths, but the weaknesses and the challenges ahead. Let me start quickly. I'm not going to touch on every speaker, but I just want to hit the high points, at least for me, sitting here in the pandemic epicenter in New York, having lived through the last 3.5 or 4 months. This is all very real. I think Peter Sands started us off really well, talking about what he called the indispensability of public-private partnerships to deal with these complex issues. And I think we've really heard compelling evidence to that effect in the last couple of days. He also said these things take work. He also told those of us in the health sector, even though we've been spending the last 2 days talking about health, that in his own look at corporate leadership, they are much more attuned to the environmental issues and climate change issues than to the issues of human health, and that we need to take that in mind as we further develop these relationships. He sort of stated clearly that the mutual understanding of the finance, business sector, and the NGO sector, as was just mentioned, they're coming from very different places, and they need an opportunity. And I think we've heard the word platform, we've heard governance, mechanisms for them to get to know each other and to really understand what they can contribute to the work ahead. And then finally, he suggested that those international organizations such as Gavi, the Global Fund, others that have provided historically already embedded in a public-private partnerships would be really important platforms to think about starting with, since they've already developed the kind of trust and understanding that would need to be developed if we're starting from scratch, although we've heard a lot of new ones that have been emerging. The head of African CDC followed him and spoke very quickly about public-private partnerships being a key part of the strategy in Africa, and also, I think from his perspective, reinforcing the importance of a really clear focus for the partnership, that if it's too mushy and too general, it won't be that effective, that the goals have to be shared, and the, if you will, self-interest of all the partners need to be aligned, and that's part of what governance is about. We had a section yesterday looking back at what could we learn from other epidemics, and I think Alan Knight raised a couple of really important issues from his corporate experience in HIV, Ebola, and COVID. The first thing he said was that he thinks the infectious disease or epidemic pandemic threat should be a part of the risk management strategies for all companies. And this because these, especially pandemics, have enormous health, but also economic and social consequences, as we've seen with COVID. And he talked about, even if you're a company that only gives donations or makes relevant products, there are other companies that actually have staff in affected countries, or staff and workforce that need to be attended to, and that everyone then has a reason for building this concern and preparedness for this concern into their risk management plan. And then finally, he noted the success in his experience in Africa of private sector companies working together. Not a common phenomenon, as he talked about, but able to do it, especially focusing on a national or a regional basis. We then had a quick introduction to the world of global pandemics, with the real threat of interruption of the economic value chain in terms of making products available when needed. Are they in high-risk areas? Are they not? And then the issue of individuals moving freely around the world, and how that we have really seen the world change in that regard. Companies, again, following that discussion, talked about, and I think many of the international agencies did as well, talking about the challenge really of the tension of moving towards COVID and doing whatever one could do to address it, but at the same time, how do you sustain your current investments? We heard real risks and fears, especially at Global Fund and others, of money moving away from vaccination, obviously NCD prevention, other areas, into COVID. And that balancing act is something that companies face, and also that international agencies face. And then we heard, I think very importantly, the special challenges of community engagement. It's come up in several ways here. The question of the role of creating a credible process, not only for all the actors in public-private partnerships, but especially for communities themselves to be engaged with cities, with countries, in order to, I think, as it was Asai said, the last mile becomes the first mile, and building local capacity, which we've heard discussed a lot here, is really the crucial variable often in success of implementation, as well as in sustainability. The platform question to bring people together, there have been a number that have been created to try to get people speaking the same language, maybe breaking down old cultures of competition to begin to deal with collaboration and suspicions, as we just discussed, of problems of rules prohibiting international organizations from working with the private sector, and a sort of skittishness and inexperience, really, even in the face of SDG 17 calling for closer collaboration. And then finally, on the really important issue of these collaborative partnerships, to keep their eye on the equity question and the availability of things that we may have seen historically as commodities, as public goods, and how will this focus be sustained going forward. And then the three last lessons I liked, I think, coming from Regina's questions and the answers there. One, what are the key things going forward? One is equity and inclusiveness in the plans, and taking Jeff's caution, the planning, and I think that means the planning process, so that if people are engaged in it, they are more likely to then be able to develop and understand what capacity they need to help to implement the plans that are developed. Secondly, in this brave new world of social media and communication, there's a lot of resistance coming into taking up even some of the good global goods we're worried about. Will we get them in time? People may or may not be willing to be vaccinated, being given disinformation, and scuttling really significant efforts to move forward together. And then finally, leadership matters. I'd say financial, technical, and political leadership. The best laid plans may or may not be implemented if the political leadership especially, and I think we've seen that certainly in my country, in the United States, decides that they're going in a different direction. And it creates great challenges for the technical and financial partnerships that are so really important to move forward. So again, thanks all that participated. This webinar has been recorded, will be available on the website shortly, and over to Clarion for final words.
I can only, Joe, I think you've captured everything. I want to thank all the participants and those in the audience. I want to thank the staff, Lisa, Julie, and main man Alex, who helped us a great deal. And I wish you all safety, and thank you again.
We look forward to seeing members of the forum in our closing session in about 10 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.